Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. I've always been a health nut, especially since I got that fitness watch for Christmas last year. 10,000 steps a day. That's been my goal every single day, rain or shine. Usually I knock it out during daylight hours, but this past winter in Vermont, the short days made it tough. That's how I found myself out walking at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in February, desperate to hit my count. I'd barely reached 4,000 steps that day. Between the blizzard that morning and being stuck on Zoom calls all afternoon, I just couldn't get moving. By evening, the snowplows had cleared most roads, and the temperature had risen to a bearable 28 degrees, practically tropical for a New England winter night. I bundled up in my warmest jacket, pulled on my boots, and headed out into the darkness. My neighborhood sits on the outskirts of Burlington, a quiet subdivision of winding streets and cul-de-sacs carved into what used to be farmland. During summer, it's alive with kids riding bikes and neighbors chatting across fences. But in winter, especially at night, it's like a ghost town. The streetlights cast eerie orange glows against the snowbanks, creating long shadows across the empty streets. I decided to walk along Forest Ridge Road, then loop around Maple Drive, before cutting through the small wooded path that would bring me back to my street. I figured that route would add about 5,000 steps, and I could make up the rest circling my basement if needed. The night was eerily quiet, that special kind of silence that only happens when snow blankets everything. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the partially salted road. I was about halfway through my planned route when I first noticed the vehicle, not a car, but a dark SUV with tinted windows. It caught my attention because it was moving so slowly, maybe 5 miles per hour at most. I moved closer to the snowbank, giving it plenty of room to pass on the narrow road. As it crawled by, I noticed the driver had dimmed the headlights to just parking lights, which struck me as odd. I couldn't make out who was inside, just a silhouette behind the wheel. I continued walking, my breath forming clouds in the cold air, when I spotted the same SUV again. This time it was parked at the intersection ahead, engine running. As I approached, it pulled away slowly, turning onto Maple Drive, exactly where I was headed. A twinge of unease crept up my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe they were looking for an address or waiting for someone. By the time I reached 7,000 steps, I was starting to feel really good about my decision to brave the cold. The night air had cleared my head after a stressful day, and I was mentally planning a hot chocolate reward when I got home. I rounded the corner onto Birch Lane, and my stomach dropped. The SUV was there again, this time with its lights completely off, parked on the side of the road. As I walked past, it pulled away from the curb and began following me, maintaining a consistent distance of about 30 feet. I picked up my pace, hoping it would pass me, but it matched my speed perfectly. My heart started pounding, and I could feel sweat forming under my winter layers despite the cold. I considered cutting through yards to get home faster, but with the snow piled high, there was no quick escape route. I made a sudden decision and stopped abruptly, turning to face the vehicle. It immediately halted too. We stood frozen in this standoff for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 15 seconds. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I pulled out my phone and held it up as if I was recording or taking pictures. The SUV's engine revved, and it suddenly sped away, turning sharply at the next corner. I practically ran the rest of the way home, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached my driveway, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling from more than just the cold. Once inside, I locked the door, drew all the blinds, and collapsed onto the couch, my fitness goal completely forgotten. An hour later, after finally calming my nerves with that promised hot chocolate spiked with a splash of bourbon, I went to check that the doors were locked again before bed. As I passed by the front window, something caught my eye. Parting the blinds just slightly, I peered out, and there it was. The SUV was parked across the street, half hidden behind my neighbor's hedge. Its lights off, but engine still running based on the exhaust clouds in the cold air. My blood turned to ice. How did they know which house was mine? I hadn't walked directly to my front door in case I was being followed. Had they been watching me before tonight? Without turning on any more lights, I moved to the kitchen and picked up my phone to call the police. But just as I was about to dial, I heard the distinct sound of my mailbox opening and closing. The metallic squeak was unmistakable. I'd been meaning to oil that hinge for months. I froze, phone in hand, paralyzed by fear. After several seconds of silence, I heard the SUV's engine grow louder as it pulled away. Once I was sure it was gone, I grabbed a flashlight and my baseball bat and cautiously approached the front door. Through the peephole, I could see the street was empty now. It took every ounce of courage to open that door, bat raised, and step onto my porch. The SUV was nowhere in sight. I pointed my flashlight at the mailbox and noticed it was slightly ajar. With the bat still clutched in one hand, I reached out and slowly opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. I didn't touch it, just illuminated it with my flashlight. Scrawled in black marker were 5 words that made my skin crawl. Nice route. See you tomorrow. I called the police immediately. They took a report and collected the note. But without a license plate or clear description of the driver, there wasn't much they could do except promise extra patrols in the area. I didn't sleep that night, or much for the next week. I installed security cameras, motion sensor lights, and even got a large dog from the shelter. It's been 3 months now, and the SUV never returned. But I've never gone back to my night walks. These days, I get my steps in at the indoor track at the community center, surrounded by other people. My fitness watch still buzzes proudly when I hit 10,000 steps, but the accomplishment feels hollow now, tainted by the memory of that night. Sometimes when I'm driving and see someone walking alone after dark, I wonder if they know, if they understand, that some routes once discovered can never be untaken. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. This happened nearly 3 years ago. I was 28 at the time and traveling to visit my then fiancée, whom I'll call Kate for this story. She had just completed her residency at a prestigious hospital in Seattle, and I made the journey to attend her graduation ceremony. Since her entire family would be at the event, she asked me to arrive a week earlier so we could spend some quality time together. I thought it was a great idea and booked a flight to arrive 7 days before the rest of her family. I reserved a room at this charming boutique hotel overlooking Puget Sound, and Kate stayed with me throughout this period. One misty morning, we decided to explore some of the lesser-known historical sites along the coast. I'd never been to the Pacific Northwest before, so the idea greatly intrigued me. Kate suggested we visit a string of abandoned lighthouses that had fascinating stories behind them. Supposedly, one was even haunted by the ghost of its last keeper. We ordered a rideshare through an app, and upon arriving at our destination, we spent about 5 hours wandering through the fog-shrouded landscapes and visiting these weathered maritime monuments. It was a captivating experience for me, since I'd always been fascinated by maritime history, but had missed the chance to see these places during my college field trips. Kate seemed pleased with my enthusiasm and kept sharing local legends as we walked. At one point, we ventured off the main trail down to a secluded beach where the remnants of a shipwreck could still be seen at low tide. The rusted metal skeleton protruding from the sand created an eerie silhouette against the gray horizon. Overall, we had a wonderful, if somewhat haunting, time. When we finally decided we'd had enough exploration and wanted to return to our hotel, the fog had grown considerably thicker and the temperature had dropped. The nearest town was several miles away, and there was no cell service at the beach. Kate suggested we hike back up to the main road, where we'd have better reception to order another ride. By the time we reached the spot, I was exhausted. The terrain had been much steeper than it appeared, and my city shoes weren't meant for such rugged hiking. I slumped against a large driftwood log while Kate stood at the edge of the road, holding her phone up, trying to get enough bars to place the request. "Got it," she exclaimed, after a few minutes of pacing back and forth. "The app says someone should be here in about 11 minutes. I nodded, too tired to respond verbally. The fog swirled around us, occasionally revealing glimpses of the churning ocean below the cliff edge. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was both soothing and ominous. I closed my eyes, just wanting to be back in our warm hotel room. After what seemed like only a few minutes, a vehicle approached through the fog. It was an older model black SUV, not the blue sedan that I vaguely recalled Kate mentioning when she booked the ride. But in my fatigued state, I didn't think much of it. Kate rose to her feet and approached the vehicle, opening the rear door and sliding in. "Are you our driver from the rideshare app?" she asked while I trudged over to join her. The man behind the wheel simply nodded without saying a word. Something about his silence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I attributed it to the overall eerie atmosphere of the foggy coastline. I climbed in after Kate and closed the door, looking back once at the lighthouse that was now barely visible through the mist. Now I realize how naive we were not to verify the driver's name and compare it with the data in the app. But at that moment, it didn't even cross my mind. Besides, it was Kate who had made the request, and I didn't have access to the driver's information. The vehicle, a black SUV with tinted windows, pulled away from the curb, but the driver remained silent. In the silence, it struck me as somewhat strange, since rideshare drivers typically confirm passengers' names and the route before starting the trip. However, this man said absolutely nothing. I still found it odd, but was too exhausted to try to make conversation. So I just leaned back and closed my eyes, lulled by the rhythmic sound of windshield wipers cutting through the fog. After a few minutes, I felt Kate's elbow sharply jab my ribs. I opened my eyes and saw her, with an expression of alarm on her face. She didn't say anything, just turned her phone screen toward me. The app showed the route we should have been following, but what I saw made my blood run cold. We were heading inland, away from the coastal road that would take us back to Seattle. My heart began to race. I looked at Kate, and her face had drained of all color. A few seconds later, her phone pinged with a notification. "Your driver has arrived," followed by another message from the actual driver asking where we were located. When we looked at the real driver's photo in the app, we realized it wasn't the same man sitting behind the wheel of the SUV. My stomach twisted into knots. I slowly turned my head to look at the driver, but said nothing. I didn't know what he was planning or what he was capable of, and frankly, I didn't want to find out. I only knew we needed to get out of this vehicle as quickly as possible. I leaned forward, trying to keep my voice steady, and said, "We've changed our minds. You can drop us off here." My goal was to get out of the situation without alarming the man. He looked at me through the rearview mirror, and for the first time since we got in, he actually made eye contact. His gaze locked with mine for several seconds, which felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 seconds. The problem was that during this time, he continued driving, completely ignoring what I had said. It was at this moment that I realized whatever this man had planned, it definitely couldn't be anything good. My exhaustion vanished, replaced by pure survival instinct. I did the only thing that came to mind. I reached into my pocket where I kept a small tactical flashlight, a gift from my brother who works in law enforcement. It was solid metal, about 6 inches long, and could serve as an improvised weapon if necessary. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white, and spoke with as much authority as I could muster. "Pull over now," I demanded. "We know you're not our driver, and our actual driver already contacted the police with your license plate." This was a complete bluff. We couldn't even see his license plate from inside the vehicle, and our real driver likely had no idea what was happening. But it was all I could think of in the moment. The man's eyes narrowed in the mirror, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might accelerate or do something drastic. Instead, he suddenly veered to the side of the narrow forest road and slammed on the brakes, causing both Kate and me to lurch forward. Before I could react further, he reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed something. My heart nearly stopped until I realized it was just a black duffel bag. Without a word, he unlocked the doors, stepped out of the SUV, and walked around to the passenger side to retrieve the bag. Kate and I didn't waste a second. We scrambled out of the opposite side of the vehicle, stumbling onto the muddy shoulder of the road. The man glanced at us once, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness, then got back behind the wheel and sped away, disappearing into the fog and leaving us stranded on a deserted road surrounded by dense forest. We stood there trying to catch our breath and calm our racing hearts. Kate was having a panic attack, and I was still trying to understand what had just happened. As she struggled to regain her composure, I realized we were in an even more precarious situation than before. We were now lost on an unknown road with no landmarks in sight, the fog growing thicker by the minute, and the light failing quickly. Once Kate managed to calm down a bit, she checked her phone. By some miracle, we had 1 bar of cell service. She messaged the real rideshare driver, explaining our situation and asking if there was any way he could find us. We pinned our location and sent it to him, hoping it would go through despite the weak signal. He says he can try to find us, but we're pretty far off the route, Kate said, her voice still shaking. He's calling the police too. While we waited, huddled together for warmth, Kate shared something that made my blood run even colder. She'd been reading local news reports that morning about a string of disappearances along the coastal highways. Tourists had been vanishing after reportedly getting into vehicles they thought were their rideshares. According to the articles, some of these victims were never found, while others were discovered days later in remote areas, robbed of all possessions and severely traumatized. Kate and I looked at each other, realizing we had been one wrong move away from becoming another statistic. When our actual driver finally found us nearly 45 minutes later, an eternity spent jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest, we were beyond relieved. Before getting into his car, we meticulously verified his identity, comparing his face to the app photo and confirming his name and vehicle details. During the ride back to Seattle, we recounted our experience to him. He told us that just last week, another passenger of his had a similar close call with what police believed was the same perpetrator, a man driving a black SUV with tinted windows, preying on tourists in areas with spotty cell reception. "You folks were smart to get out when you did," he said soberly. "The cops have been trying to catch this guy for months. He knows exactly where the dead zones are for cell service along these roads." When we finally arrived back at our hotel, we filed a police report describing the fake driver and the vehicle in as much detail as we could remember. The detective who took our statement warned us that these cases were difficult to solve. The perpetrator was careful to avoid areas with security cameras, and the fog had obscured any distinguishing features of the vehicle. We never received any follow-up from the police, which means the man was likely never caught. What's even worse, he could still be out there, possibly with new victims. After that day, I vowed never to get into any rideshare without thoroughly checking all the driver's details first. And I now always share my ride status with multiple contacts, no matter how short the trip. The truth is, we were incredibly lucky to escape with our lives. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, remembering those cold, calculating eyes watching me through the rearview mirror. And I wonder what might have happened if we hadn't gotten out when we did. And whenever I visit a new place now, the first thing I research isn't the tourist attractions. It's the local emergency numbers and the safest transportation options. One detail I'll never forget. As the SUV drove away, leaving us on that foggy road, I caught a glimpse of something in the back cargo area through the rear window. What looked like several backpacks and suitcases. I didn't mention this to Kate at the time, not wanting to frighten her further, but I've often wondered who those belongings belonged to, and whether their owners ever made it home. I'll never forget that frigid winter night when everything changed. I was working late at the hospital, finishing charts after a grueling 12-hour shift in the emergency room. The small town of Pinecrest usually shut down early, but hospitals never sleep. When I finally signed out at 3 in the morning, the snow had started falling, thick, heavy flakes that muffled every sound. My apartment was only about 20 minutes away on foot, and despite the cold, I decided to walk. After being cooped up inside sterile walls all day, I needed fresh air. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to the night shift staff, their windshields already gathering a thin layer of white. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and set off. Pinecrest at night was usually peaceful, but that night it felt different. The snowfall had emptied the streets entirely. Even the late-night diner, that usually had a few trucks parked outside, was dark. The only illumination came from the streetlights, creating pools of yellow that seemed to float in the darkness between them. Each step I took crunched loudly in the snow, echoing between the buildings. I tried to focus on getting home, where a hot shower and warm bed awaited me. My thoughts drifted to the patient I'd treated earlier, a teenage girl who'd come in with mysterious bruises she couldn't explain. Something about her haunted expression kept returning to me. I was so lost in thought that at first I didn't notice the sound, the soft purr of an engine. I glanced over my shoulder and saw headlights moving slowly behind me, about half a block back. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably someone being cautious on the icy roads. But after I turned onto Maple Street and the car followed, I felt the first twinge of uneasiness. The vehicle maintained the same distance, moving at exactly the pace I was walking. I couldn't make out the model in the snow and darkness, just that it was large, maybe an SUV or a truck, with its high beams off but running lights on. I quickened my steps slightly, and the vehicle matched my pace perfectly. I told myself not to be paranoid. This was Pinecrest, after all, where everyone knew everyone. It was probably just someone who recognized me from the hospital, or maybe someone who lived on one of these streets and was driving carefully because of the weather. But when I made a deliberate turn onto Cedar Lane, which would add 5 minutes to my journey, but wasn't the most obvious route, the vehicle turned too. My heart rate increased. I pulled out my phone, fingers stiff with cold, thinking I should call someone. But who? It was the middle of the night, and what would I even say? I'm being followed by a car that hasn't actually done anything threatening. The screen glowed bright in the darkness, showing 0 reception bars. The snowstorm must have affected the cell towers. I remembered the 24-hour gas station, just 2 blocks ahead. If I could reach it, there would be people, light, safety. I picked up my pace again, nearly jogging now, my breath making small clouds in front of my face. The vehicle accelerated too, the engine noise growing louder. Before I could react, it pulled alongside me, moving so close to the curb that snow sprayed up from its tires. The passenger window rolled down with a mechanical hum. "Excuse me," called a voice from inside. I couldn't see the driver clearly through the darkened window, just a silhouette wearing what looked like a baseball cap. "Are you all right? It's freezing out. Need a ride?" The voice sounded friendly enough, but something about it sent chills through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I shook my head without stopping. "No thanks, I'm almost home," I lied, not breaking stride. Instead of driving on, the vehicle crept alongside me. "You sure? Roads are getting bad. Not safe to be out walking alone." That's when I noticed there was no license plate on the front of the vehicle. Or if there was, it was covered in snow or mud. I couldn't tell which. "I'm fine," I said more firmly, picking up my pace even more. The car continued to crawl beside me for another half block before suddenly accelerating ahead. For a moment, I felt relief wash over me, until the vehicle made a sharp U-turn about 50 yards ahead and came to a stop, blocking the sidewalk entirely. The driver's door opened. A tall figure stepped out, face obscured by the cap and the shadow it cast. He was wearing a heavy winter coat that made his frame look bulky and imposing. "I really think you should get in," he said, his voice no longer friendly but commanding. Like I said, it's not safe out here. I stopped dead in my tracks, my mind racing. The gas station was still a block away. If I turned and ran, would I make it before he could get back in his vehicle? Or would running just trigger some predatory instinct to chase? That's when I noticed something else. The vehicle's back door was slightly ajar, and I caught a glimpse of movement inside. There was someone else in there. The man took a step toward me. "Look, I'm just trying to help. The roads are icy, and you're going to slip and hurt yourself out here all alone." For some reason, my mind flashed to the bruised teenage girl from my shift. Her voice barely audible, saying, "He seemed so nice at first." I took a deep breath, my hand slipping into my coat pocket, where I kept my hospital ID badge attached to a retractable cord with a heavy metal clip. Not much, but better than nothing. "My husband is a police officer," I said loudly, with more confidence than I felt. "He's expecting me, and I just texted him that I'm almost home." The man paused, then smiled. His teeth gleamed in the dim light. "No, you didn't. Your phone has no signal in this storm." My blood turned to ice. He'd been watching me that closely. Before I could respond, headlights appeared behind me, illuminating the scene. An actual police cruiser turned onto the street, its tires crunching on the fresh snow. The man's expression changed instantly. He gave me one last look, not of fear or concern at being caught, but of terrible disappointment, before climbing quickly back into his vehicle. The engine revved, and he pulled away with surprising speed given the weather conditions, turning at the next corner and disappearing. The police car pulled up beside me, and the window rolled down. Officer Jenkins, who I recognized from his frequent visits to the ER, with arrested individuals needing medical clearance, peered out at me. "Dr. Pierce, everything okay? Saw you talking to that vehicle." I explained what had happened, the relief making my knees weak. Officer Jenkins frowned. "Doesn't sound like anyone from around here. I'll put out an alert." He insisted on driving me the rest of the way home, which I gratefully accepted. It wasn't until 3 days later that I understood what I'd narrowly escaped. A woman was found just outside town limits, half buried in snow. She'd been missing for 2 days, last seen walking home from work. The details weren't released to the public, but as hospital staff, I heard them anyway. She'd been abducted by 2 individuals in an unregistered vehicle. Sometimes I still wake up in the night, thinking about those headlights in my rearview mirror. about the voice that said it's not safe out here, about the movement I glimpsed in the backseat, and I wonder about the bruised girl from my shift that night, and if she too had been warned about the dangers of being alone. As a startup founder in Seattle, my days often blurred together in a chaotic stream of meetings, calls, and endless emails. By the time I closed my laptop each night, my mind felt as drained as if I'd run an ultramarathon through the Cascades. The one thing I cherished above all else was my quiet evenings at home. My house wasn't anything special, a century-old craftsman on the edge of the city with creaky floors and drafty windows. But it was mine, and it represented sanctuary in a world that constantly demanded my attention. It was a Wednesday in late February, with rain pattering against the windows, the kind of night where you sink into the couch and let silence fill the room after a day packed with investor meetings and damage control from our latest product launch. All I wanted was to watch my favorite documentary series with a glass of bourbon. The house was quiet, that particular stillness you only appreciate when you're truly alone. I had no idea how fragile that silence was. Around 11:30, as I was contemplating heading upstairs to bed, my smartwatch vibrated against my wrist. It wasn't a call or message, but a notification from my home security app. Motion detected at the basement entrance. My first reaction was to dismiss it as a false alarm. These systems are often too sensitive, and it wouldn't be the first time the alert had triggered without any apparent cause. I opened the app, saw the notification, and without paying much attention, dismissed the alert. Probably just a raccoon or something, I muttered to myself, convincing myself it was nothing serious. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom on the second floor, and with the sound of rain against the window, I began to drift off. But then I heard a muffled thud. My eyes shot open instantly. I held my breath and tried to hear anything beyond the rain, when another sound came through, impossible to ignore. A heavy scraping across the wooden floor downstairs. My heart constricted while my mind searched for rational explanations, but none seemed convincing. I slid out of bed and quietly closed my bedroom door. My pulse pounded in my ears as I considered my options. I had taken precautions. All doors and windows had sensors. My phone was connected to the security system, and I even kept a baseball bat behind my bedroom door. But none of this gave me comfort now. The idea that someone was in my house felt like a violation I wasn't prepared for. Another noise, sharper this time, like glass breaking. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispered my address to the operator, and explained what I was hearing. She assured me that police were on their way. Please ask them not to use sirens or flashers when they arrive. If someone's here, they'll notice, I added. The operator's voice was calming, yet somehow surreal. She stayed on the line while I grabbed the bat and positioned myself in the farthest corner of the room, keeping the phone pressed to my ear. Each second seemed eternal. The creaks and groans of the house that had once been familiar now sounded sinister, as if the very walls were conspiring against me. Then I heard it, faint footsteps on the stairs. I gripped the bat tighter as adrenaline surged through my veins. Whoever it was, they weren't rushing, ascending deliberately, measuring each step. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to imagine who might be on the other side of the door. Was it one person or several? Then the footsteps stopped, and the silence became louder than any noise. Next came a light touch on my bedroom door. Not a hard knock, just a gentle pressure, as if testing whether it was locked. My hand trembled as I raised the bat, trying desperately not to spiral into panic. The operator's voice still sounded in my ear, steady and reassuring. "Police are almost there," she said. I heard what sounded like someone trying the handle, gently at first, then with more force. My entire body tensed, ready to swing the bat with everything I had if that door opened. Then came a whisper from the other side, so faint I almost missed it. "Is anyone home?" The voice sounded young, almost uncertain. Before I could process this, I heard movement outside. Car doors opening and closing, hushed voices. The police had arrived. I heard commotion downstairs, shouting, something heavy falling to the floor, then silence again. Finally, a voice called out, "Police. You can come out now." Cautiously, I opened the door, still clutching the bat, and stepped into the hallway. A police officer met me at the top of the stairs, his expression serious but calm. "We've got them," he said. 3 individuals. They were still on the main floor when we entered. My legs nearly gave out as I made my way downstairs to the living room. 3 figures sat handcuffed on my floor, 2 men, and surprisingly, a woman. Their faces were tense, defiant. One officer explained they had entered through the basement window, which they had managed to pry open despite the security system. They thought no one was home because there were no lights on upstairs, the officer added. And then I realized I had been watching my documentary in the dark living room, and they must have been watching the house, seeing no signs of life on the second floor. The police searched the house and found crowbars, duct tape, and zip ties in their backpacks. My blood ran cold at the implications. One officer approached and said, "You did everything right, locked yourself in, and called us immediately. That probably saved your life tonight." His words only made sense hours later when I was checked into a hotel room, unable to return home. I replayed each moment in my head, the motion alert, the gentle testing of my door, the whispered question. All of it shattered any sense of security I had. What haunted me most was learning later that these weren't random burglars. The police discovered they had been tracking my online presence for weeks, monitoring my social media, where I had unwittingly shared details about my home and schedule. The woman had even attempted to connect with me on a professional networking site just days earlier. In the weeks that followed, I installed reinforced security and cameras with motion sensors. I changed my online habits completely, removing any personal details from my profiles. But even with all these precautions, I still find myself lying awake some nights, straining to hear through the silence. Being alone at night used to be a luxury, a chance to escape from the noise of the world. Now it's become a reminder that peace can be deceptive, and security is never guaranteed. But I've also learned something about myself, that even in moments of pure terror, I can think clearly enough to survive. And somehow, that knowledge helps me sleep a little better, even as I listen for footsteps in the dark. When my parents decided to take a weekend trip to visit my sister's new house in Vermont, I was more than thrilled to have our old farmhouse to myself. As a 32-year-old doctoral candidate buried in research on rural American folklore, the isolated atmosphere of our property just outside of Salem, Massachusetts, was the perfect setting to catch up on my work. They packed their bags and said goodbye on Friday afternoon, leaving me with their usual reminders. Don't forget to feed the chickens, lock the cellar door, and of course, take my medication. That first evening, I settled into the creaking wooden chair at my father's antique desk, surrounded by stacks of yellowed manuscripts and a plate of leftover shepherd's pie. Occasionally, the distant sound of a truck on the county road, or the rustle of autumn leaves against the windows, would break the silence of the house. As I finally climbed the narrow staircase to my childhood bedroom around 2 a.m, I felt satisfied with my progress and grateful for the chance to work uninterrupted throughout the weekend. But that satisfaction was short-lived. Saturday night found me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by my notes, nursing my 4th cup of black coffee. The house was unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for something, anything. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, each sound seemingly louder than the last. It was approaching midnight when the landline phone rang. At first, I barely registered it. Hardly anyone called our house phone anymore. But I figured it might be my parents checking in from my sister's place, where cell reception was notoriously spotty. I answered with a casual hello, but was met with silence on the other end of the line. Hello, I repeated, pressing the receiver closer to my ear. All I could hear was a faint crackling static, like someone breathing slowly into the mouthpiece. Beneath it, another sound, running water perhaps. I frowned and hung up, attributing it to a wrong number or a bad connection. But it left me with an unsettling feeling that lingered throughout the night. The next evening, I was immersed in transcribing a particularly fascinating account of 18th century witch trial testimonies when the phone rang again. This time, I hesitated before answering. Hello, I asked, now more cautious. A moment of silence, and then a whisper. I can see the candles in your window. A chill ran down my spine, and I immediately slammed the receiver down. I hadn't lit any candles. I sat frozen, staring at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. After a minute of tense silence, I forced myself to look out the window. The property was dark, with only the motion-sensing floodlight illuminating part of the gravel driveway. But then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the circle of light, motionless, just a silhouette against the tree line. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I convinced myself it was nothing significant. Perhaps it was a prank, some local teenager trying to scare the neighbors on a boring Sunday night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the locks 3 times before going to bed, but every small sound in that quiet house only amplified my anxiety. The fact that I had actually lit candles earlier, but had blown them out hours ago, troubled me deeply. How long had someone been watching me? By Monday night, the anxiety had become unbearable. I immersed myself in work, trying to distract myself with music and caffeine. Around 9 in the evening, I heard a soft sound from the living room, a light tapping, as if someone was knocking on the window. I froze. The sound repeated, gentle, like someone touching the glass with their fingertips. My hands trembled as I carefully approached. I peered through the doorway into the living room, but it was empty. The curtains were still, no movement outside that I could detect. Just as I began to relax, a louder noise echoed through the house. Now it was coming from the back porch. I grabbed a fire poker from beside the hearth and cautiously approached. I looked through the small window in the door, but no one was there. The wooden porch was empty, bathed in moonlight. The phone rang again, piercing the silence. I snatched up the receiver, heart racing. "Who are you? What do you want this time?" I demanded. The whisper was slower, deliberate. "Did you know your father never locks the root cellar?" My entire body tensed, every instinct screaming at me not to look, but curiosity won out. The root cellar entrance was visible from the kitchen window, a slanted wooden door set into the ground that led beneath the house. To my horror, I could see it was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible where it should have been closed. With disgust churning in my stomach, I dialed 911, explained the situation to the operator. She promised to send officers immediately. When the police arrived, the cellar door was closed, and they found no signs of anyone having been around the property. One of the officers suggested it could be local kids playing a prank. I nodded in agreement, but deep down, I knew something was deeply wrong. Tuesday night was the worst. Around midnight, I saw that figure again, the same silhouette by the tree line, but something was different this time. The posture seemed altered, even their height appeared changed. I turned off all the lights and peered through the curtains. They stood there for several minutes, then vanished into the darkness. An hour later, they appeared again, now closer to the house, wearing what looked like a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring what might have been their face. The phone rang again, but I didn't answer. The persistent sound of ringing seemed to mock me. I remained awake all night, unable to sleep, clutching the fire poker and keeping all lights off. When the sun finally rose, I felt immense relief at having survived the night. I opened the door to breathe in the fresh morning air and froze in place. On the porch was a small leather-bound journal that wasn't ours. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it to find detailed observations about me. Notes about my daily routines, when I took my medication, what I ate for dinner, even quotes of conversations I'd had on the phone with my academic advisor. The entries dated back 3 months. Alongside the writing were small pressed flowers, all taken from our garden. The final entry, dated yesterday, simply read, "He doesn't lock the cellar. Neither did his father." My hands shook as I gathered the journal, my mind racing with unanswerable questions. Who wrote this? How long had they been watching me? Why did they mention my father? I called the police again, this time handing over the journal as evidence. They took my statement and promised to increase patrols in the area, but little could be done without a suspect. Needless to say, it was the last night I spent alone in that house. My parents returned the next day, and I told them everything. They were horrified and immediately installed a security system. My father was particularly disturbed by the mention of the cellar, becoming quiet and withdrawn after I showed him the journal. Months have passed, but the feeling of being watched has never disappeared. Whoever it was, they weren't just playing with me. They wanted me to feel vulnerable. They wanted me to know they could see me anytime they wanted. And that's a fear I will never be able to shake. 3 days after my parents returned, my father took me aside and showed me something he'd kept hidden for years. Newspaper clippings about a series of stalking incidents in our area from the 1970s. The victims were all members of families who, like ours, had purchased homes from the old Willard estate. The perpetrator was never caught, but the incident stopped abruptly after one family moved away. "I thought it was over," my father whispered. "It's been quiet for so long. Sometimes at night, I still hear tapping on my window. And sometimes, when I gather the courage to look, I see different figures standing in different places. Never the same person twice, but always watching. Always waiting. And the cellar door. We've changed the lock 3 times, but still, some mornings, we find it slightly open." Nights in Seattle were always rainy, but the walk back to my apartment in the historic district was usually peaceful, if a bit eerie during the early hours of dawn. That night in December, as I finished my shift at the downtown hospital, I was exhausted and ready to return to my small apartment overlooking the bay. The streets glistened with rain, interrupted only by occasional passing cars or muffled music from late-night diners. I took my usual route through several narrow side streets, grateful for the protection of my umbrella against the light drizzle. That's when I noticed something unusual: a vintage porcelain theater mask lying face up on the wet sidewalk. It wasn't one of those cheap party store masks, but something that looked antique, possibly handcrafted. The eyes were hollow, dark openings, and the smile was painted with such detail that it seemed unnaturally expressive, almost knowing. For a moment, I thought someone must have dropped it accidentally, but the longer I stared, the more an uncomfortable sensation crept over me. Something felt wrong. It was disturbing in how deliberately it seemed to be placed, right under the amber glow of an old street lamp. I shook my head and laughed at myself. "It's just a mask," I whispered, quickening my pace. But even after I returned home and settled into bed, its image remained vivid in my mind. The following night, returning home after a particularly grueling 12-hour shift, something made me pause as I approached my building. Across the street, beneath a flickering street lamp, stood a figure wearing that exact same mask. Initially, I assumed they were looking at another window, but as I fumbled with my keys and glanced up, I realized with a jolt that the figure was staring directly at my third-floor apartment window. My heart hammered against my ribs. I tried to convince myself it was merely a prank, perhaps a bored college student trying to frighten random strangers. Yet even with this rationalization, cold sweat beaded on the back of my neck. I hurried inside, locked the door behind me, and turned off all the lights. Still, from the darkness of my living room, I peered through the blinds. The masked figure remained motionless, standing in the rain without an umbrella or any sign of discomfort. After several minutes, they simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog that had begun rolling in from the water. I tried to forget about it. People do strange things in this city, right? But the next night, my heart nearly stopped when I saw the same figure, standing in the exact same spot. Now they held something in their hands, what appeared to be a small, leather-bound journal. My palms grew sweaty as I searched for my keys, pretending not to notice anything unusual. Once safely inside my apartment, I locked everything and closed the blinds, but couldn't resist peeking through a narrow gap. The figure now stood directly in front of my building, illuminated by the street lamp. Over the next several days, the pattern continued. Each time I returned home, this person materialized somewhere nearby, sometimes beneath the street lamp, sometimes closer to my window, sometimes in the shadows of the alleyway beside my building. They never moved while I watched, but their presence became impossible to ignore. My anxiety intensified with each encounter. I began constantly looking over my shoulder during my walks home and changed my schedule to finish work earlier, hoping to avoid these nighttime encounters. One night, I decided to take a completely different route home, thinking that if they didn't know which way I was coming, perhaps they'd lose interest or at least reveal they weren't actually following me. But as I turned the corner onto an unfamiliar street, 6 blocks from my usual path, my blood froze. The masked figure was already there, waiting. They tilted their heads slightly, as if acknowledging my attempt to evade them. That's when I noticed something different. Now they carried a weathered wooden box under one arm. I considered calling the police, but what could I say? There's someone in a vintage mask standing near my building. This person hadn't directly threatened me or done anything explicitly harmful, but it was clear this was no longer a simple prank. They were waiting for something. They were waiting for me. That night I barely slept, startling awake at every creak and groan of the old building. At 3:17 in the morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I got up and checked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the pressure in my chest made me hesitate before returning to bed. Then I heard a sound that paralyzed me. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my door. I held my breath, half expecting the door to burst open despite the deadbolt and chain. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering, "Someone's knocking at my door at 3 in the morning. I think it's the same person who's been following me for the past week." The dispatcher assured me officers were already on their way. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, as far from the door as possible. The knocking continued, steady, unhurried, almost polite, and then abruptly stopped. Complete silence fell, more terrifying than the knocking had been. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, the figure was gone. They found no signs of attempted entry, but they did discover something left propped against my door, the wooden box I'd seen earlier. Inside was the porcelain mask I'd first seen on the sidewalk, along with a folded piece of parchment. Written in elegant calligraphy were the words, "You dropped this 73 years ago. I've been waiting to return it." I moved to a different apartment complex in another part of the city the following week. I still don't know who that person was, or what they meant by that message. After I relocated, my former landlord installed security cameras throughout the building. I never contacted them to find out if they captured anything, but sometimes, when I'm walking home late at night, I still instinctively look behind me, half expecting to see that familiar mask watching from the shadows. And occasionally in my dreams, I see myself wearing it, standing beneath a street lamp, waiting. I was 22 and had just moved to Montana after landing my first job with a wildlife conservation group. The mountains around Blackwater County were breathtaking, jagged peaks that seemed to tear at the sky, dense pine forests, and valleys that stretched into forever. With 3 weeks before my official start date, I figured I'd get to know the wilderness that would become my office. On a crisp autumn morning, I decided to hike Shadow Ridge Trail. According to the weathered information board at the trailhead, it was a moderate 5-mile loop that wound through old-growth forest before circling back. Perfect for a half-day excursion. I packed light, just a small backpack with a couple water bottles, some trail mix, and my analog camera. I'd purposely left my phone in the car, wanting to disconnect completely and enjoy the solitude. The parking area was empty, except for a mud-splattered pickup truck parked near the entrance. Judging by the layer of dust on its windshield, it had been there for at least a day or two. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would leave their vehicle for so long at such a remote trailhead. But Montana was full of serious backpackers who disappeared into the wilderness for days at a time. The trail started gently enough, winding between towering ponderosa pines. The morning light filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air was cool and carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was exactly the escape I'd been hoping for. I'd been hiking for about 45 minutes when I saw him, a man sitting on a fallen log just off the trail. He was in his 50s, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes were well worn but practical. Canvas pants, a faded flannel shirt, and sturdy hiking boots caked with mud. A walking stick rested against the log beside him. He nodded as I approached, and I returned the gesture with a smile. There was something about him that seemed perfectly at home in these woods, like he was just another fixture of the landscape. I assumed he was heading back to the trailhead, since he looked like he'd been out for quite some time. His clothes were dirty and sweat-stained around the collar. I continued past him, losing myself in the rhythm of the hike and the sounds of the forest. The trail began to climb, switchbacking up a ridge that offered glimpses of the valley below. I remember stopping to take a photograph of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead when I heard a shout behind me. Turning around, I saw the same man from earlier jogging up the trail, waving his arm to get my attention. I waited, curious about what could be so urgent. "Shadow Ridge?" he asked between slightly labored breaths, pointing at the trail ahead. I nodded. "That's what I'm following, yeah." He shook his head and gestured to a narrow path branching off to the left that I hadn't noticed before. "That's Shadow Ridge. This here's an old maintenance trail that loops around to nowhere. Folks get turned around here all the time." He had a slight accent I couldn't quite place, something vaguely Midwestern, but worn smooth by years away. "Oh," I said, genuinely grateful. "Thanks for catching me. I didn't even see that turn." "No problem," he replied with an easy smile. "I've been hiking these mountains for 17 years. Hate hearing about tourists getting lost because of poor trail markings." He gestured toward the correct path. "You heading up to the overlook?" I nodded, and he fell into step beside me as we took the left fork. "I'm headed that way myself. Don't mind the company, do you?" What could I say? He just saved me from potentially getting lost, and he seemed harmless enough, just an experienced local hiker. So I said I didn't mind, though truthfully, I had been looking forward to solitude. As we walked, he told me He lived in a cabin not far from the trailhead and hiked these trails almost daily. He pointed out things I would have missed: a woodpecker's nest high in a dead tree, tracks of a mountain lion that had crossed the path recently, a cluster of mushrooms that were either mighty fine eating or your last meal, depending on whether you knew what you were doing. After about 20 minutes, our conversation gradually tapered off into a slightly uncomfortable silence. He walked slightly behind me now, and I could feel his eyes on my back. The trail had narrowed considerably, with dense undergrowth pressing in from both sides. Something felt off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. We'd been hiking for over an hour when I realized the trail should have started looping back toward the parking lot by now. The 5-mile loop I'd planned to take shouldn't have gone this deep into the mountains. I was about to mention this when my boot caught on something metal half buried in the trail. I looked down and saw a rusted steel rail emerging from the dirt. My eyes followed it forward to where the narrow trail opened into a small clearing. There, cut into the side of the mountain, was the entrance to an old mine shaft. Rotting timber supports framed a dark opening, about 6 feet high. The rusted rails ran straight into that darkness. Curious, I approached the entrance and peered inside. The daylight penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed by absolute darkness. A cold draft emerged from the opening, carrying a musty, metallic smell. Interesting, I said, mostly to myself. This wasn't mentioned on any of the trail guides. When there was no response, I turned around and found the man standing much closer than I expected, barely 6 feet away. The friendly expression was gone from his face, replaced by something blank and watchful. His eyes looked different somehow, flatter, like those of a snake. "Go inside," he said. His voice had changed too. The conversational tone was gone, replaced by something cold and commanding. "It's been waiting for you." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the mine. "What's been waiting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I casually shifted my position to create more distance between us. "It gets so hungry," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "So many years between visitors. But it can smell you now." He took a step toward me, reaching into his pocket and pulling out something that glinted in the dappled sunlight, a hunting knife with a worn wooden handle. Pure instinct took over. I bolted, darting around him and back down the trail. I expected to hear footsteps behind me, to feel a hand grabbing at my jacket or worse. But after the initial sounds of pursuit, there was nothing. I risked a glance back after about 50 yards and saw something that made me run even faster. The man wasn't chasing me. He was standing at the mine entrance, perfectly still, watching me flee. And then, as I watched, he turned and walked into the darkness of the mine, disappearing completely. I ran until my lungs burned, following the trail back the way we had come. When I reached the fork where he'd first corrected my path, I took the right trail this time. The one he'd claimed was wrong. Within 30 minutes, I was back at the parking lot. The pickup truck was gone. Later that evening, after I'd calmed down enough to think clearly, I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office. The deputy listened politely, but didn't seem particularly concerned until I mentioned the mine. "There aren't any old mines along Shadow Ridge," he said, frowning. "You sure about where this happened?" When I insisted, he pulled out a Forest Service map of the area and asked me to show him. I traced our route as best I could remember. The deputy's expression changed. "This area here," he said, tapping the spot where I believed the mine to be, "is what locals call the dead zone. There was a mining operation there back in the 1880s. Collapsed after a flash flood in 1903. Killed 27 miners." He leaned back in his chair. "There have been stories about that place for generations. Hikers claiming they met a friendly guide who tried to lead them to the old mine entrance. Always describes himself as a local who's been there for years." "Has anyone ever followed him in?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. The deputy's face was grim. 3 hikers disappeared in that area in 1976. Search parties found their gear scattered around that old mine entrance, but no bodies were ever recovered. He gave me a long look. "The thing is, the mine entrance itself shouldn't exist anymore. It was dynamited and sealed by the Forest Service in 1958. I never hiked Shadow Ridge again. I stayed with the conservation group for 2 years, but I stuck to team expeditions and well-traveled routes. Sometimes at night, I still dream about that mine entrance and what might be waiting inside it, hungry after all these years. And sometimes, when I'm in a crowded place and catch a certain expression on a stranger's face, that flat, watchful look, I remember the man on the trail and wonder how many others like him are out there, waiting to guide lost hikers home." In the winter of 1997, I was living alone in a small cabin nestled deep in the mountains of Montana. My nearest neighbor was about 2 miles down the winding dirt road, and visitors were rare unless someone had gotten terribly lost or the occasional delivery driver braved the journey. The isolation suited me just fine. I'd moved there specifically to work on my novel without distractions. That particular evening in late January, I was returning home after spending the day at the local library in town, arriving just after 8. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow had begun to fall, creating a peaceful silence that enveloped the forest around me. As I turned the final bend before my cabin, my headlights illuminated a figure standing on my porch. My blood ran cold. There was a woman, probably in her early 30s, wearing what appeared to be a thin jacket completely unsuitable for the weather. More alarmingly, there wasn't another vehicle in sight. My driveway stretched empty behind my truck, and the surrounding area offered no hint of how she might have arrived. I parked beside the woodpile and cautiously stepped out, scanning the tree line for any movement. The crunch of snow beneath my boots seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness as I approached my cabin. The woman turned toward me, her face breaking into a wide, relieved smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank goodness you're home," she called out, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place. "My car broke down about a mile back, and my phone is dead. I've been walking for what feels like forever." I kept my distance, positioning myself at the bottom of the porch steps. "That's rough," I replied, not moving closer. "Which direction did you come from?" I didn't pass any stranded vehicles on my way in. Her smile faltered slightly before returning, wider than before. "Oh, it's on one of those little side roads. I thought it might be a shortcut. You know how GPS can be so unreliable up here." I nodded, though I knew there weren't any side roads within miles that would qualify as shortcuts to anywhere. The town's about 17 miles back down the main road, I offered. If you head that way and turn right at the fork, you'll reach a gas station in about 5 miles where you can call a tow truck. Instead of acknowledging my directions, she hugged herself, visibly shivering. "It's so cold out here," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "Could I possibly come in for just a few minutes to warm up? Maybe use your phone to call for help. I'd be so grateful." Something about her demeanor felt rehearsed, like an actress who'd memorized her lines but couldn't quite sell the emotion behind them. I'd lived in cities long enough to develop a sixth sense for danger, and every instinct was now screaming at me. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you with that," I said firmly. "I can drive you to the gas station myself if you're cold." Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of something calculated crossing her features before settling back into helpless vulnerability. "Please," she persisted, taking a step toward me. "Just for a few minutes. It's freezing out here." "I think it's best if you head toward town," I repeated, climbing the steps but maintaining enough distance that she couldn't easily touch me. "Or I can give you a ride, but I'm not comfortable having strangers in my home." The pleasant mask slipped again, this time revealing a flicker of annoyance. Then she laughed softly, as though we were sharing some private joke. "You're being silly," she said, her voice dropping to something more intimate. "I'm just a woman who needs a little help. What are you afraid might happen?" I reached past her and unlocked my door, careful to keep my body between her and the entrance. "My offer stands for the ride to town. Otherwise, I wish you luck." Before she could respond, I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, immediately engaging the deadbolt and chain lock as well. Through the window, I watched as she remained on the porch for several long moments, no longer pretending to shiver, before finally descending the steps and walking slowly down my driveway. I waited until she disappeared from view, before letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands were trembling as I poured myself a generous whiskey and collapsed into my armchair. To calm my nerves, I fired up my laptop and put on a documentary about ocean life, something soothing and far removed from my current situation. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sharp rap at the door. The documentary had ended, and the screen showed it was just after 11. Another knock followed, more insistent this time. "Hello, sir? I'm so sorry to bother you again," came the woman's voice, sounding distressed. "But I've been walking for hours, and I'm completely lost. Please, I think I might have frostbite. I just need to use your phone." I remained perfectly still, listening. Something about the quality of her voice seemed different. It echoed strangely, as though she wasn't standing directly at the door. I silently moved to the window and carefully pulled back the edge of the curtain just enough to peek outside. What I saw turned my blood to ice. In the moonlight reflecting off the snow, I could make out at least 8 figures scattered around my property. 2 men stood at the edge of the tree line, near my truck. Another 3 were positioned along the side of the cabin, partially hidden in shadows. A couple more waited at the bottom of the porch steps. The woman stood at my door, and I noticed now that she held something in her hand, possibly a small radio or walkie-talkie. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. When the dispatcher answered, I whispered my situation and address, terrified that the people outside might hear me through the cabin's thin walls. While I waited for help to arrive, I heard them moving around the perimeter of the cabin, their footsteps crunching in the snow. They spoke in hushed tones, and I caught fragments of conversation, something about another place further up, and taking too long. The woman continued her performance at the door, her voice rising and falling in practiced distress, occasionally calling out what she claimed was her situation. Not once did any of them try to force entry, which somehow made the whole scenario even more terrifying. They were patient, waiting for me to make the mistake of opening the door voluntarily. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, I saw the blessed flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the snow through my window. The response time was remarkably fast for such a remote location. Later, I would learn that a state trooper had coincidentally been less than 5 miles away when the call came through. The moment the patrol car's headlights appeared down my driveway, the figures scattered, melting into the forest with practiced efficiency. By the time the officer reached my door, there was no sign of the woman or her companions aside from multiple sets of footprints in the fresh snow. The officer took my statement and searched the surrounding area, but found nothing except tracks leading deep into the forest, away from the road and in the opposite direction from town. He advised me to stay vigilant and promised to increase patrols in the area. 5 days later, I received a call from that same officer. A family living in a remote cabin about 12 miles further into the mountains had been found dead. Husband, wife, and their teenage son. Their home had been ransacked, but the doors had been unlocked, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. Their vehicle was missing, and judging by the food left on the table, they had been in the middle of dinner when whatever happened, happened. The officer didn't explicitly connect the dots for me, but he didn't need to. I knew in my bones that the same group had succeeded elsewhere, where they had failed with me. The thought that I might have ended up like that family, or worse, that I might have inadvertently helped them by giving the woman a ride to another isolated home, still haunts me to this day. I sold the cabin 3 weeks later and moved back to the city. Sometimes I miss the peace and quiet of mountain living, but I'll never again take for granted the security that comes with having neighbors close enough to hear you scream. Let me tell you about something that happened to me last winter. I worked the graveyard shift at a data center in rural Montana, 3 nights a week, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. This schedule means I've gotten used to being awake when the rest of the world is asleep, even on my days off. There's something peaceful about those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when it feels like the universe belongs to just you and the stars. After about a year on this schedule, I finally stopped trying to force myself back into a normal routine on my off days. It was just making me perpetually exhausted and irritable, so I embraced my nocturnal lifestyle completely. I'd usually sleep until around 4 in the afternoon and stay up until around 8 or 9 in the morning. It was actually pretty great once I committed to it. I had the whole night to myself while everyone else was sleeping. One night in January, during a rare warm spell that melted most of the snow, I decided to go for a late-night hike. It was about 2 in the morning, which for me was like early afternoon. I'd eaten my breakfast, caught up on some reading, and decided I needed to stretch my legs. There's a beautiful nature preserve that borders my property. One of the reasons I bought this place, despite its remote location. The preserve has a 5-mile loop trail that winds through pine forests and around a small lake. During the day, it's fairly popular, but at night, it's completely deserted. Or at least, it's supposed to be. I was finishing my second loop when I noticed a figure standing on the path ahead. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe another night owl enjoying the unseasonable warmth. But as I got closer, something felt off. He was just standing there, completely motionless, wearing a pale gray hoodie and baggy cargo pants. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see he was facing my direction, but I couldn't make out his features. As I approached, I expected him to acknowledge me with a nod or a quiet hello. That's what people normally do when they encounter each other in such isolated spots. Instead, he remained perfectly still until I was about to pass him. Then, very slowly, he turned his head to follow my movement. Just his head, while the rest of his body remained frozen in place. The unnatural quality of that movement sent a chill down my spine. After I passed, I glanced back and saw that he hadn't moved from his spot. He was just standing there, his head now turned in my direction. I picked up my pace a bit, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe he was just some guy meditating or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to cut my hike short and head back. The trail loops around the lake before returning to the main entrance, so I'd have to pass that spot again unless I wanted to bushwhack through the forest. I chose the latter, taking a smaller maintenance path that the park rangers use. It added about 20 minutes to my journey, but I preferred that to encountering the strange man again. When I finally reached the main trail near the entrance, I breathed a sigh of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Standing at the trailhead, illuminated by the single solar-powered lamp, was the same figure in the gray hoodie. There was absolutely no way he could have gotten there before me, unless he had sprinted at an incredible speed. And even then, I should have heard him running on the gravel path. My heart hammering in my chest, I turned and began walking quickly toward my house, staying on the dimly lit road rather than taking my usual shortcut through the woods. The road route added nearly a mile to my walk home, but it felt safer somehow, more exposed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I didn't see him following me. When I finally reached my house, I locked the door behind me, drew the blinds, and poured myself a glass of water with shaking hands. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was letting my imagination run wild. I sat down on my couch, flipped on the TV, and tried to distract myself with a late-night show. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps on my wooden porch. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped right in front of my door. I muted the TV and sat perfectly still, listening. No knock came. No doorbell rang. Just silence. After about 30 seconds, curiosity overcame my fear, and I crept to the peephole and looked out. The man in the gray hoodie stood on my porch, about 3 feet from my door. I could see his face now, unnaturally pale, with dark circles under his eyes that looked almost like bruises. His expression was blank, devoid of any emotion. He wasn't looking at the door, but instead seemed to be studying my house, his gaze moving methodically across the facade. I backed away from the door, trying not to make a sound. My phone was in the kitchen, and I slowly made my way there, never taking my eyes off the front door. I called the sheriff's department. We don't have local police out here, and reported a suspicious person at my property. The dispatcher told me a deputy was about 20 minutes away and advised me to stay on the line. I crept back to the peephole. The man was still there, in exactly the same position, still examining my house with that same methodical gaze. He didn't knock, didn't try the doorknob, didn't do anything that a normal person would do. He just observed. For the entire 18 minutes it took for the sheriff's deputy to arrive, the man never moved from that spot. When the patrol car pulled into my driveway, its headlights illuminating the porch, the man slowly turned toward it. He made no attempt to run or hide. The deputy approached him, and I could see them talking through the peephole, though I couldn't hear what they were saying. After a few minutes, the deputy knocked on my door. When I opened it, the man in the gray hoodie was sitting in the back of the patrol car. He says he's staying at the Pinewood Motel, the deputy told me. Claims he got lost hiking and was trying to figure out where he was. Says he thought this might be the ranger station. I explained that the ranger station was on the opposite side of the preserve, with a large sign out front, and that there was no way he could have mistaken my house for it. The deputy nodded thoughtfully. Well, he hasn't actually broken any laws that I can charge him with, he said. But something's definitely off about him. I'll run his ID, take him back to the motel, and have a word with the manager there. You might want to invest in some security cameras. I thanked him and watched as the patrol car drove away with the strange man in the back seat. I didn't sleep at all that night, jumping at every creak and rustle of the wind. The next day, curious despite my fear, I drove to the Pinewood Motel. The manager confirmed that they'd had a guest matching that description, but he had checked out early that morning. He'd paid in cash and left no forwarding address. I installed security cameras the following week and started carrying pepper spray on my hikes. I also varied my route and timing just to be safe. I never saw the man in the gray hoodie again, but sometimes when I'm hiking that trail at night, I get the distinct feeling that I'm being watched. The sheriff's deputy later told me they ran the ID the man provided, and it belonged to someone who had died 3 years earlier in Idaho. Whoever he was, whatever he wanted, he was gone now, at least from my part of the woods. But I often wonder if he's out there somewhere, standing motionless on another trail, turning just his head to watch as hikers pass by in the dark. It was a frigid winter night in rural Vermont, and I was alone in my grandfather's colonial farmhouse, nursing a mug of bourbon-spiked coffee to keep me alert. The deadline for my dissertation loomed just 48 hours away, and finishing my work tonight would give me the breathing room I desperately needed before my final defense next week. The howling wind rattled the century-old windows as snow piled against the north side of the house. I'd retreated to the study on the second floor, a room filled with leather-bound books and the lingering scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco, where the ancient radiator actually worked well enough to keep my fingers from going numb. I was deep in concentration, the blue glow of my laptop illuminating my tired face, when the first sound broke my focus. a dull thud from somewhere downstairs. I glanced up at the mahogany door of the study, listening intently. The old farmhouse had stood through countless Vermont winters, and I told myself it was just the building settling under the weight of fresh snow, or perhaps a branch scraping against the kitchen window. I returned to my work, determined to push through at least one more chapter before allowing myself a few precious hours of sleep. But not 5 minutes later, another sound, different this time, like something heavy being dragged across the wooden floorboards. Setting my coffee down, I rose from the creaking desk chair and moved to the doorway. The hallway beyond was pitch black. I'd kept all the other lights off to save on the ridiculous heating bill. I stood there, straining my ears against the silence, trying to calculate if investigating was worth the disruption to my workflow. After 30 seconds of nothing but the wind's mournful cry, I retreated back to my desk, chiding myself for being so easily distracted. The farmhouse was nearly 200 years old. Strange noises were part of its charm, however unsettling they might be after midnight. For almost 2 hours, I worked without interruption, making significant progress on my analysis section. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway had just struck 2 when a much louder crash echoed through the house. It sounded like it came from the basement, directly beneath the kitchen, and was far too deliberate to be dismissed as the house settling. My heart rate quickened as I pushed back from the desk and strode quickly to the hallway. Standing at the top of the main staircase, I peered down into the darkness below. Moonlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, casting elongated shadows across the antique furniture. The house remained utterly still and silent. Gathering my courage, I descended 3 steps, gripping the polished banister tightly. From this vantage point, I could see part of the kitchen and the closed door that led down to the basement. Everything seemed undisturbed. I waited another minute, listening for any subtle sound that might betray an intruder's presence. Nothing. I retreated back to the study, my mind racing with possibilities, yet still unable to truly believe someone would brave this blizzard to break into an isolated farmhouse. I returned to my laptop, but my concentration was broken. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift to the partially open door, anticipating another disturbance. Just as I was beginning to relax again, a floorboard creaked in the hallway, not downstairs, but right outside the study. My blood turned to ice as a shadow moved past the doorway. In that fraction of a second, I caught the silhouette of a tall figure passing by, heading toward my grandfather's bedroom. There was no mistake. Someone was in the house with me. Panic surged through my body. I heard the intruder enter the master bedroom and begin rummaging through drawers. Moving as quietly as possible, I reached the study door and locked it, wincing at the soft click of the mechanism. The movement in the neighboring room stopped abruptly. 3 seconds of terrible silence passed, and then heavy footsteps began marching directly toward my door. I backed away, frantically searching for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. I grabbed a heavy brass letter opener from the desk, knowing it was pitiful protection, but better than nothing. The doorknob rattled violently as the intruder tried to enter. Then came the first shoulder slam against the solid oak door, the frame groaning under the assault. Each impact felt like it would splinter the wood, but the old craftsmanship held. After 4 thunderous attempts, the pounding stopped. I heard ragged breathing on the other side, followed by footsteps moving away toward the stairs. My shaking hands fumbled for my phone, and I dialed 911 as I listened to the intruder descend to the first floor. I whispered my emergency to the dispatcher, terrified the intruder would hear me. The front door opened and closed, and for a brief moment I thought they had left. But then came the sound I'll never forget, scraping outside the house, like someone climbing up the exterior wall. Within seconds, there was scratching at the window of the study, a window that overlooked a 20-foot drop with no ledge or trellis to assist a climber. How could anyone be out there in this storm at that height? The scratching intensified, and then the curtains parted slightly of their own accord. I glimpsed a pale face peering in, eyes reflecting the glow of my laptop in a way that seemed almost luminous. The face was gaunt, with features distorted by the frost on the glass, but the expression was one of focused hunger. I backed into the farthest corner, clutching the letter opener so tightly my knuckles turned white. The window began to inch upward despite being locked, as if the mechanism was being manipulated from outside. Cold air and snowflakes rushed in through the widening gap. A hand, unnaturally long-fingered and gray, curled around the window frame. Just then, blue and red lights flashed through the trees, lining the long driveway. The sheriff's department had arrived in record time, likely because Deputy Hansen lived just down the road. The hand withdrew instantly, and I heard what sounded like someone or something scrabbling rapidly down the side of the house. When the police entered and searched the property, they found fresh footprints in the snow leading away from the house and into the woods, but the blizzard quickly obscured the trail. More disturbing were the marks on the side of the house, deep gouges in the wooden siding that led all the way up to the study window, as if someone had climbed using only their fingernails for purchase. The police report cited an attempted burglary, suggesting the intruder might have been looking for prescription medications or valuables, perhaps desperate enough to brave the storm. They increased patrols in the area for the next few weeks, but no similar incidents were reported. I moved out of the farmhouse the next day. What haunts me most aren't the questions about who the intruder was or what they wanted. It's the certainty that no human could have climbed that exterior wall in a blizzard, and the memory of those eyes staring through the glass, hungry not for valuables, I'm convinced, but for something else entirely. Sometimes when the wind howls on winter nights, I imagine I hear scratching at my window, and I wonder if whatever visited me that night is still searching, still hungry, still determined to finish what it started. I was driving back from my winter cabin in northern Montana. The journey home to Seattle was supposed to be long, about 18 hours, but I was determined to do it in one shot without stopping at a hotel. I'd done similar trips before, and with enough coffee and classic rock keeping me company, I figured I'd make it just fine. When the heavy snow started falling around midnight, my eyes began to feel like they were made of lead. I forced myself to stay alert, munching on beef jerky and sipping the last of my energy drink. But the caffeine buzz was fading fast. I knew eventually I'd need to pull over, maybe just for an hour, or even rest until dawn. The highway had become eerily empty, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 40 minutes. No towns or rest stops appeared on the horizon, just endless pine trees and mountains looming in the darkness. I slowed down and checked my GPS to see what places might be coming up, but the nearest town was still over an hour away. With the snow getting heavier and my eyelids growing heavier by the minute, I honestly wasn't sure if I could make it there safely. After fighting to stay awake for another 15 minutes, I realized I couldn't continue. Through the swirling snow, I spotted a sign indicating a truck stop half a mile ahead. I signaled, though there was no one behind me to signal for, and took the exit. The truck stop was isolated, situated at the junction of two deserted roads that seemed to lead into absolute nothingness. A single flickering neon sign reading "Last Chance Gas" cast an eerie blue glow over the empty parking lot. I pulled into a spot near the small convenience store and spent the next several minutes watching from my car, making sure the place was safe. Strange that there were no trucks here at a truck stop, I thought. Not a single vehicle approached the station, and not even one car passed by on the main road. The convenience store appeared dark inside, with only a security light illuminating what looked like an empty cashier's counter. It was an unsettling place to be stranded, but I didn't feel threatened since there seemed to be no one around. I reclined my seat, turned off the engine to save gas, and drifted off to sleep with the soft patter of snowflakes hitting my windshield as a lullaby. I don't remember checking the time before falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, my dashboard clock read 3:15 in the morning. I was in that foggy state between sleeping and waking, unsure at first what had roused me. Then I heard it, a metallic scraping sound coming from outside. I turned my head slowly and saw a tall, gaunt figure standing by one of the gas pumps. The person was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned attendant's uniform, but something was off about it. The outfit seemed worn and tattered around the edges. I could see him fiddling with something at the pump, but the structure blocked most of my view. What I couldn't see, however, was his vehicle. There wasn't one in the parking lot, not even by the pumps. I scanned the area again, and still saw no other cars or trucks anywhere. The falling snow had created a pristine white blanket across the entire lot, unmarked by tire tracks or footprints, which made no sense at all. The figure continued doing whatever he was doing for another minute, then turned and walked away. I lost sight of him when the gas station structure blocked my view, but it appeared he was heading toward the road. After a few minutes, I assumed he was gone, but I still had no idea what he had been doing there, which left me feeling deeply uneasy. I was too exhausted to dwell on it, though. The warmth of my car and the hypnotic effect of the now heavy snowfall lulled me back towards sleep. I closed my eyes, thinking I'd just rest until dawn. I couldn't have been asleep for more than 20 minutes when I jolted awake to the sound of something tapping against my car window. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to see the same tall figure peering into my car through the driver's side window. Only now I could see his face clearly in the blue neon light. His skin was pale, too pale, with deep-set eyes that reflected the neon like a cat's. But what froze my blood was his expression, or rather, the complete lack of one. He stared through the glass with no emotion whatsoever, as if he wasn't even seeing me. I heard him trying the door handle. Once, twice, 3 times. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The man was behaving as if he didn't even notice I was inside the car. Yet he was looking directly through the window. Perhaps the lighting was too poor for him to see me, or perhaps the thought that crept into my mind then was too disturbing to entertain. This man clearly had malicious intentions. I remained perfectly still, barely breathing, hoping he would just go away. Suddenly, he turned and walked back toward the side of the gas station. He bent down to pick something up, and that's when I instantly started my car, hit the gas, and backed out as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figure straighten up, holding what looked like a rusted tire iron in his hands. He stood motionless in the falling snow, watching my taillights disappear into the night. But the most chilling part, in the fresh snow covering the parking lot, I could see my tire tracks clearly. But there were no footprints around the pumps or leading to my car. None at all. My heart was pounding so violently that I was now completely awake, and stayed that way for the remaining 10 hours of my journey. What that man, if he was a man, was trying to do, I truly don't want to know. But the circumstances surrounding the encounter were terrifying. He had obviously been there tampering with the gas pumps, and was just moments away from breaking my window and doing something. I later searched online for information about that truck stop. According to local legend, it was built on the site of a gruesome accident in the 1970s, when a gas station attendant was crushed between two semi-trucks during a blizzard. They say on snowy nights, he still tries to service vehicles that stop there, and becomes enraged when he can't complete his work. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never drive that stretch of highway again without enough caffeine to keep me alert for days. My boyfriend suggested I post this story here because I've been having night terrors lately. He thinks getting it out in the open might help me process everything. I haven't told my therapist about this. I see him for anxiety and depression issues I had even before the incident, because I don't want him to think I'm losing my mind. I guess I should explain what happened. This all started last June in Phoenix, Arizona, over a period of about 6 weeks during the most brutal part of summer. I'd just begun nursing school at Arizona State, and between classes and my part-time job at a local clinic, I barely had time to breathe. Running became my escape, my way to clear my head despite the desert heat. Despite having some hip alignment issues that made running uncomfortable, I pushed through. I didn't have time for the gym anymore, so early morning runs before the sun turned the city into an oven became my new routine. The neighborhood where I live has an artificial creek system, one of those man-made waterways that winds through the suburbs, making everyone feel like they live somewhere with actual natural water features. It's really just glorified irrigation, but they've built jogging paths alongside it, which makes for a nice route. I enjoyed running there, because seeing and hearing the water made it feel like I was escaping the endless concrete and desert landscaping, even if the creek was completely artificial. I didn't know then just how artificial it was. One day in mid-June, I went jogging during an especially brutal heat wave. The temperature had already hit 95 degrees by 8 in the morning. I was running along my usual path when I noticed the most horrible smell coming from the creek. It was absolutely revolting. When we have droughts, which is basically all the time in Arizona, the creek becomes a shallow, stagnant trickle that bakes in the sun. At least that's what I told myself was causing the stench. The truth was, the creek smelled like something else entirely. It reminded me of when I worked as an aide in a nursing home during college. I was caring for a patient who had a bed sore that had become necrotic and infected. A hot, putrid odor that clings to your clothes and hair. That's what the creek smelled like that day. I tried to jog faster, covering my nose with my shirt. I couldn't believe the other people running on the path weren't as affected as I was. The smell was overwhelming, in my nose, in my mouth, almost like I was swimming through it. I thought maybe my medical background made me more sensitive to the odor. Finally, I reached the point where the path turns away from the creek and runs behind the houses of my subdivision. I was relieved to be away from the waterway and continued my run, deciding the stench must be from some animal that had died in there, or maybe sewage backup from the recent storms. I hadn't been running much longer before something else caught my attention. I was listening to music on my wireless earbuds, and in between songs, I heard a strange noise coming from behind me. It was breathing, labored, wet breathing. Not the heavy panting of someone out of shape trying to run, but breathing that sounded like physical trauma. Like someone drowning, gasping for air mixed with liquid. I immediately pulled out my earbuds and whipped my head around to see what was happening. I'm going to ask for your patience as I continue. I feel physically ill typing this. I almost want to delete this entire post, but I need to share this because someone else might have experienced something similar. I turned around and saw where the breathing was coming from. It wasn't coming from a person jogging behind me. It was coming from a figure running backwards. The person wasn't jogging normally in reverse. They were running backwards in an almost mechanical way. Their arms were bent at 90-degree angles, fiercely pumping up and down as they propelled themselves toward me. I've seen people do backward running drills for athletic training, but this wasn't like that. This was something else entirely. All I could see was the back of their head. They had wet, dark hair and wore a navy baseball cap and a black athletic jacket. My first thought wasn't even, what the hell is happening? But rather, who would wear a black jacket in this heat? My thoughts were interrupted by the repetitive sound of fabric rubbing against fabric. The figure was running faster. I didn't have time to think, except that I needed to get away as quickly as possible. I knew I could sprint up the path, across the grassy area to the alley behind my house. I started running as fast as I could. I had forgotten about my earbuds, and I could feel the cord slapping against my legs as I fled. My chest tightened, and my legs burned with effort. I was so close to home. I could hear the wet, gurgling sounds behind me as the figure gained speed. I started to cry as I continued sprinting down the alley that led to my backyard. I could see my fence. I had hoped that I would make it, that this nightmare would end. The horrible breathing sounds were right behind me as I reached my gate. I lunged for the latch, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't grip it properly. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew any second that thing would appear around the corner and come for me. But it didn't. It kept running down the alley. Still trembling but slightly relieved, I turned to look at its face. What I saw next nearly brought me to my knees. The figure didn't have a face, not like there was just skin where features should be. It was as if the back of its head had been duplicated on the front. Dark wet hair, navy cap, but no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just nothing where a face should be. I finally managed to open the gate and ran inside, slamming it behind me. I could hear my roommate in the kitchen. "How was your run?" she called out. I just ran to her and buried my face in her shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. I cried for a good couple of minutes before I pulled away, and she asked what was wrong and if I was okay. I told her I needed to go to the bathroom first. I went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my face. I was almost hyperventilating. I was shaking so hard. I took several deep breaths and tried to calm myself down, but then I felt a rising in my throat. I quickly lifted the toilet lid and braced myself over the bowl. I lurched and vomited into the water. I always close my eyes while throwing up because seeing it only makes me continue. I could feel the bitter burn in my nose and throat as I heaved repeatedly. Finally, after what had to be at least 8 violent retches into the toilet, I caught my breath, wiped my mouth, and opened my eyes. There in the bowl wasn't what I had eaten for breakfast. It was a murky mixture of mud, algae, and what looked like creek water. And it smelled like decay. I couldn't write anymore that day. It felt like if I continued typing, I might somehow summon that thing back into existence. I'm not sure if sharing this has made me feel better, but at least it's out there now. I don't sleep at my place anymore. I stay with my boyfriend every night, especially since I started hearing that wet breathing again outside my bedroom window last week. Yesterday, my roommate texted me about a weird algae bloom in the creek that's making it smell terrible. She sent a picture. The water had turned black in some places. And this morning, when I was grabbing clothes from my room, I found wet footprints leading from my window to my bed. They weren't coming from outside in. They were going from my bed to the window. And they weren't human footprints. They were too wide, with what looked like webbing between the toes. I never thought I would regret a spontaneous decision this much. If you asked me back then, I would have told you I'm a logical person. Paranormal mumbo-jumbo doesn't exactly sit well with my rational mind. If something strange happens, I immediately try to figure out the scientific explanation. I think this night terrifies me precisely because there is no rational explanation. There's no scientific closure for what happened to us during what should have been a simple hiking trip to Blackridge Mountain. As a 24-year-old mother fresh out of the Marine Corps, I wanted to spend quality time with my 3-year-old daughter Lily. Military service meant I spent much of her early life away from her, and I desperately wanted to reconnect. The hiking trip was a spontaneous decision. I've always been good at those. I didn't want some tourist trap with paved trails and souvenir shops every half mile. I didn't want to be surrounded by people taking selfies and pretending to commune with nature while checking their Instagram feeds. I wanted authentic wilderness exploration, something primitive and real. That's actually harder to find than you might expect, even in the mountains of Oregon. I turned to some obscure hiking forums, found a remote trail about 2 hours from Portland, and packed up the car. I invited my housemates. Yes, I had a complicated living situation. There was my ex-husband Connor, his new girlfriend Megan, and our mutual friend Jake. Despite the relationship drama, we maintained a civil household for Lily's sake. At the time, we were all navigating the awkwardness without arguing, so we were being friendly and cordial. They agreed to the trip. We figured it would be nice to get away together. We even brought our dog Rusty. The moment we were all in the car, I punched the coordinates into my GPS, and off we went. That's when the trouble started, probably when we should have turned around. It was about 3 in the afternoon when we left. My navigation suggested about 2 hours to the trailhead, enough time to hike about a mile to a camping site, set up, and enjoy some time before darkness fell. Satisfied, we broke out snacks and enjoyed swapping funny stories, while Lily happily munched on crackers in her car seat. By 6 in the evening, we realized we couldn't find the damn place. My navigation insisted we were there, but there was no trailhead, just dense forest and a barely visible dirt road. Frustration mounting, I stopped at a small general store in the last town we passed through. After the elderly shopkeeper finished chuckling at my map, he handed me an old-fashioned paper map, showed me where we'd gone wrong, and continued laughing as I purchased the map and a few extra supplies. I left feeling annoyed, but also unsettled. The man had laughed far more than seemed normal. I dismissed it as small-town amusement at city folks, getting lost, and returned to the car. Once we were back on track, our friendly banter resumed. It was starting to get dark, but I didn't want to be discouraged. We could do this. It was just a simple hiking trip after all. I realized how wrong I was when it took another hour to find the trailhead. There was supposed to be a small sign and a modest gravel area for a few cars. Now in near darkness, that sign turned out to be a weathered wooden post half hidden by overgrowth. We had driven past it repeatedly, arguing about whether we should give up the search for this elusive trail. Jake finally spotted the sign. Gratefully, I parked on the small patch of gravel, and Connor happily pointed out the narrow trail we'd been looking for. It looked more like a game trail than something meant for human hikers. We put on our backpacks full of gear and sprayed ourselves with insect repellent. I handed Lily her water bottle and took her hand. She was tired, but excited to finally be out of the car. Rusty trotted beside us, pulling at his leash, alert but seemingly happy. We followed the trail for about half a mile before coming into a clearing. There were strange stone formations arranged in a rough circle, and a small wooden information kiosk stood at one end. I distinctly remembered the forum post stating we needed to walk a full mile before reaching any suitable camping areas. But everyone was tired, it was dark, and we just wanted to set up camp. I set Lily down near the kiosk as a light drizzle began to fall. The weather forecast hadn't predicted rain, but it was warm and humid, so we welcomed the light shower. We tied Rusty to the kiosk as Jake started preparing a fire pit. Connor and Megan began setting up the tent. Lily stayed by Jake's side as I looked for dry kindling under the tree line. That's when curiosity got the better of me, and I examined the information display. I expected trail maps and wildlife warnings. Instead, I read about an ancient Native American burial ground dating back centuries. "Hey guys," I called, my voice shaking slightly. This is a sacred burial site. Connor and Jake shrugged. My grandmother was part Cherokee, Connor said. I think we're good. I'm like a quarter Navajo, Megan added, as if genetic ancestry would somehow protect us. I shook my head. I'm not taking chances with this. If we keep walking down the path, Jake interrupted. We'll be fine, Vanessa. We're all exhausted, and I don't fancy hiking any further in the dark. Fine, I sighed. But if something happens, I want it publicly known that I did not want to camp here. I turned toward the stone formations. I mean no disrespect, I whispered. Please let us stay just for tonight. The others laughed and made jokes about offering sacrifices before returning to their tasks. I grabbed our hatchet and my folding knife, then set off to find more wood. Lily stayed with Jake, happily playing with some pebbles. Look, some idiots left trash here, I muttered, noticing debris near one of the stones. Megan had followed me. That's disrespectful, I nodded. Remind me to pick that up before we leave. I don't want any bad karma. We wandered down a separate path to find firewood. After we'd walked through numerous spider webs and collected a decent amount of dry wood, we returned to find a small fire going and our tent erected. Rusty was dozing peacefully near the tent, and Lily was happily playing with her stuffed rabbit. I smiled. Finally camping. The crickets and frogs were making their evening chorus. The sky was thick with clouds, but there was a pleasant breeze, though the air remained stifling. I tried to get Jake aside to talk to him, but he was being withdrawn and quiet. Connor and Megan retreated to the tent to organize sleeping arrangements, which left me alone. I decided to work off some frustration by chopping firewood from a fallen tree down the main path, away from everyone else. Alone in the dark, my anger made me fearless until I reached the tree. I felt eyes on me. Not malicious eyes, but definitely watchful. As I walked down the path, my anger evaporated, replaced by rising fear. I've been camping before and have felt observed by foxes, coyotes, and other wildlife. This didn't feel like those times. I didn't feel threatened, just watched. I tried to dismiss it as anxiety from being alone in the woods after reading about the burial ground. I started swinging the hatchet and immediately felt better, still watched, but better. I chopped until I'd removed most of the fallen tree's larger branches, my shoulders aching from the effort. I grabbed my flashlight and turned to leave when I heard something rustle in the bushes. I jumped, hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other. Megan appeared around the bend, and my heart nearly stopped. You scared me half to death, I exclaimed. She wanted to talk about Connor, so I gathered the newly cut firewood and we walked back together. When we returned, Connor and Jake were talking rapidly in hushed tones. I dropped the firewood and asked what had happened. We saw someone, Connor exclaimed, pointing to the far side of the clearing. A Native American. Traditional clothing. They were right there. Jake saw them too, didn't you? I looked around, suddenly realizing Lily wasn't nearby. Where's Lily? I demanded, my voice sharp with fear. In the tent playing. She was getting eaten alive by mosquitoes, even with the repellent, Connor said quickly. Did you actually see? I started asking Jake. Jake didn't say anything. He sat by the fire, poking at it with a stick, his eyes wide and fixed on the flames. For a moment we were all silent, listening to the crackling fire. It was as if we all felt it at the same time. That same feeling of being watched overwhelmed us, and I swallowed hard, my hand moving to the knife at my hip. "Do you?" I started, but Jake jumped up and put his finger to his lips. "SHH. Do you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes widening further. We listened. I suddenly realized all the normal forest noises had stopped. No crickets, no frogs, no rustling insects. Just silence and a faint rhythmic sound. "Is that drums?" Megan whispered. "We're miles from anywhere," I whispered back. "There shouldn't be any drums out here." "Definitely drums," Connor said, his voice unusually solemn. The bushes across the fire rustled violently, and we all jumped. The wail that followed the movement was enough to make Megan scream. It sounded horrible, like a woman in agony. It also sounded terrifyingly close. Jake turned to look at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Get in the tent," I ordered. "Put another log on the fire. It could be a mountain lion or a coyote." The howl didn't sound like any animal call I'd researched before our trip, but I wasn't taking chances. Rusty, typically calm and obedient, was snarling and yanking at his leash. I untied him and ushered him into the tent with us. For a while we all sat inside, listening. The strange silence had returned, and we whispered about it nervously. Megan suggested we listen to music on her phone to calm ourselves. I watched the fire through the mesh window of the tent. The flames were dying down, which made me uneasy. "We need to put more wood on the fire," I said into the music-softened silence. No one volunteered to go outside. It had been about half an hour since the strange wail. My daughter was still quietly playing with her rabbit and a small flashlight we'd given her. It seemed odd that she was still awake and so quiet throughout all this, but we were too on edge to really notice. Frustrated that neither of the men was offering to tend the fire, I grabbed the hatchet and my flashlight. Jake shook his head. "Vanessa, the fire's almost dead. Look, it's just embers. Don't go out there. If it's a predator, it'll be braver facing just one person." I shook my head and reached for the tent zipper. Just as I started to open it, Jake gasped. Through the fabric of the tent, I could see the fire suddenly blaze back to life. I walked back to the window, carefully stepping over Lily, who had finally decided to lie down. The fire was crackling, vigorously despite the wood having burned down to ash. Perhaps a breeze had stirred the embers. "I'm going to put a log on before it burns out again," I muttered, trying to mask my fear with practical action. Before anyone could protest, I unzipped the flap and stood up in the firelight. I scanned the darkness for the telltale reflection of animal eyes, but saw nothing. I heard nothing either. I swallowed hard and made my way to the woodpile, hatchet ready in case something lunged at me. I felt the eyes again, not threatening, not hostile, just watching. It was the most unnerving sensation I've ever experienced. I'd almost prefer something attacking me outright than this creeping, persistent observation. I placed 3 logs on the surprisingly robust fire, and feigning calmness, walked back to the tent. "Let's try to sleep before the fire goes out," I suggested, lying down beside my drowsy daughter. "If we stay up like this, we'll just keep scaring ourselves silly. It's the wilderness, after all." Jake lay down on Lily's other side. Connor and Megan arranged themselves near our feet, so we were all comfortable. Despite the warm night, I draped my arm protectively around my daughter. She closed her eyes, and as I closed mine, the screaming began. Lily sat bolt upright. She hadn't been asleep for even a second. She clamped her hands over her ears and started singing, "Row, row, row your boat," at the top of her lungs, screaming the words as if in terrible pain. We all jerked upright, and I quickly grabbed her, trying to soothe her, trying to pull her hands from her ears. My heart was pounding furiously. Everyone was staring at her in shocked silence. She wouldn't stop screaming and singing, screaming and singing. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she wouldn't stop. Suddenly, she fell silent mid-scream and opened her eyes. She looked distant, thoughtful, older than 3, as if she wasn't fully awake. She stated calmly, "The ancestors are angry." First, let me assure you that no one had mentioned anything about ancestors or spirits in front of her. She was 3 years old. She could form simple sentences, but I had never taught her to say things like that. She didn't attend preschool yet. No one had told her about Native American burial grounds. We had talked about animals and trees, but nothing else. After she made that statement, the silent forest erupted. I have no better way to describe the sudden cacophony that assaulted us. There were hundreds of animal sounds, screaming, howling, growling, barking, hooting all around us. Steady, brave Rusty was shivering and whimpering in the corner of the tent, as far from Lily and the entrance as possible. My daughter resumed her singing and screaming, while the rest of us lost our minds. "What the hell is going on?" Connor was shouting. "Do you hear the drums?" "They're getting louder," Megan cried. I placed my daughter back on the ground. Her eyes were rolling wildly, and I didn't know what to do. My heart felt ready to explode. My hand gripped my knife, but what good would that do? Didn't some tribes use animal calls during ceremonies and hunting? Jake yelled over the impossibly loud noises. "Yes," I muttered, eyes wide. "I read about that somewhere." We were shouting at each other now over the violent rustling of bushes, the thunderous drumming, and the horrible screams. There was that wail again, the agonized woman, the screeching mountain lion, the howling coyote, so close I could almost feel the breath behind it. I felt a panic attack brewing until I looked at Lily again. Then I was furious. "Leave her alone," I screamed, standing up. "She's 3. This is her first camping trip. Leave her the hell alone." I was crying now, enraged and terrified, willing to fight whatever forces were tormenting my child if only it would stop. Just as suddenly as it started, everything fell silent. My daughter blinked a few times, yawned, and lay back down while we stared at her in disbelief. I was still sobbing, more from relief and shock than anything else. It was so quiet, I almost wished for the noise again. Then a cricket chirped, softly at first, then louder. Finally, the forest returned to its normal nighttime symphony, and I collapsed back onto my sleeping bag, exhausted. "What just happened?" I asked wearily. We all exchanged confused, frightened glances. "I don't know, but I think we should leave at first light," Jake said quietly. "I'm sorry, Vanessa. You were right. We shouldn't have camped here." I nodded. "Let's just try to sleep. It's nearly 2 in the morning. We'll pack up when the sun rises." Everyone nodded, and we all lay back down. I held my sleeping daughter tightly. She was breathing steadily, absolutely fine, as if nothing had happened. I shivered, remembering her unearthly screams and that creepy singing. Finally, I started to doze. I jerked awake when something struck my leg. I waited for someone to say they'd accidentally kicked me, but no one spoke. "Did one of you just hit my leg?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jake turned over and shook his head. Connor and Megan sat up and denied it as well. I looked down at my thigh and saw a red mark in the shape of a handprint. A small handprint, like a child's, but not Lily's. She was still sleeping peacefully beside me. My heart started pounding again as I remembered my anger, my screaming. Had I somehow offended the spirits of this place? Something dripped onto the tent roof. For the briefest moment, I wondered if it had started raining. When I looked up and the others followed my gaze, I let out a tiny whimper of despair. A dark liquid was seeping through the tent fabric. In the dim light from Jake's flashlight, it looked black, but I knew what it was. Blood. All my worst nightmares flooded my mind. What was above our tent? Some kind of sacrificed animal. Something worse. "Is that?" Jake stuttered, pointing upward. I couldn't speak. My daughter stirred at this point. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. I didn't know what to do. At 3:37 in the morning, the forest erupted for the second time. As soon as the noise began, Lily awoke and started singing again. Everyone was screaming in terror, while I sat frozen in shock. I couldn't move. This wasn't happening. This was some kind of nightmare. Maybe if I remained perfectly still, it would all go away, and someone would appear to tell me how silly I looked, scared on some hidden camera show. But no one came, and no one was taking charge. "We're leaving," I yelled over everyone else. "Now, just shove everything in the bags. Don't leave anything behind." I started cramming miscellaneous items into backpacks. I couldn't help Lily. She just sat in the middle of the tent, rocking back and forth, singing and screaming, her eyes rolling wildly in their sockets. I tried not to look at her as we hastily packed. If I had, I'd probably have covered my ears and started singing a childhood song too. Once we finished packing the interior, the noises outside began to subside. We exited the tent anyway and started dismantling it. I kept watch for animals or anything worse while clutching Lily's arm. She continued singing softly. I wanted to tell her to stop, but I couldn't bring myself to shout at her. I loved her too much, and I couldn't believe this was happening to my child. Instead, I focused on the grim task of ensuring nothing would harm us as we prepared to leave. After we were packed, we started down the path back to the car. I could still feel eyes watching us. I stopped suddenly, remembering the trash by the stones, and cursed under my breath. I have to get that garbage. I promised not to leave it, and there's no way I'm breaking that promise now, I said grimly, terrified but determined. Surprisingly, Megan went with me. We collected the litter and stuffed it into our backpacks before hurrying back to the others. Jake made sure the fire was completely extinguished, and we continued toward the car. The eerie silence accompanied us the entire way. Our unseen observers followed us until we were halfway back to the trailhead. Then Lily stopped and looked behind us. "Mommy," she murmured tiredly, "the spirits are saying goodbye." She had that faraway look in her eyes again, as if she wasn't quite present, and she looked exhausted. I nodded. "Wave goodbye," I muttered sarcastically. She waved. I tried not to shiver but failed. We threw our equipment into the car and piled in. Normal forest sounds surrounded us again. You could almost believe nothing had happened. All four of us rolled down our windows and shouted apologies as we drove away. We even felt a bit silly, terrified but silly. We were starving, so we stopped at a 24-hour diner in the next town. It was 4 a.m. Jake stuck his head out the back window and asked the waitress, "Have you ever been hiking near the old burial ground off Forest Trail?" The woman shook her head. "No. Here's your food, sir." Jake looked her dead in the eye, grabbed our bags of food, and said, "Don't. The place is haunted." I drove off as the woman stared at us in confusion. Megan started laughing nervously, then Connor, then Jake, and finally me. We were all laughing hysterically, the adrenaline wearing off. We had survived. We didn't die. We felt ridiculous, but we never speak about that place. Every once in a while, my now 6-year-old daughter will ask if I remember the ancestors in the woods, because she does. Row, row, row your boat. I work in a canning facility in northern Washington state. It's not the biggest in the world, but it's certainly impressive. A 24/7 operation during peak harvest season. This summer, I landed an internship in the quality control lab, running food safety checks around the production and warehouse areas. I've stumbled across many strange things during my inspections. Rats feasting on fallen product, discarded drug paraphernalia, massive spiders, and once I even walked in on 2 warehouse employees in a compromising position behind a row of pallets stacked 35 feet high. None of these discoveries could have prepared me for what happened yesterday and this morning. 2 nights ago, there was a storm, a real nasty one. Gale force winds and torrential rain pummeled the facility. The night shift lost power about halfway through their work, so management decided to send everyone home and close until morning. By the time I arrived for my 7 o'clock shift, police cars, power company trucks, and emergency response vehicles surrounded the facility. Workers were gathered in the outside break area, smoking cigarettes while waiting for clearance to return to work. I made my way through the crowd, approached the plant manager, Harrison, and asked him what was happening. Apparently, during the storm, the winds had been strong enough to topple an old pine tree that crashed through the back wall of warehouse number 5. A solid 40-foot stretch of wall was destroyed, along with some of the ceiling and tons of canned food pallets. Harrison told me that once we got the all clear, he and I would need to walk through the warehouse areas to take inventory of what we had lost. Since warehouse number 5 was rarely used during the off-season, except for storing empty cans and forklifts, work wasn't canceled for the day. In the meantime, I could organize safety data sheets for the various cleaning chemicals we kept in the front offices, which were still accessible. After about an hour of writing and attaching warning labels to barrels of chemicals, Harrison came into the storage room and told me they were ready for the inspection. We needed to clear the other 4 warehouses before allowing the remaining employees access. The inspection started routinely in the production areas and warehouse number 1. An old water bottle here Some dirty gloves there, nothing unusual. Warehouse number 2 is where things started to get weird. If you've ever been in a warehouse for canned products, you understand how creepy it can be to walk down the narrow paths between pallet stacks. Imagine 40-foot-high stacks of silver, cans towering over a 2.5-foot wide path that's nearly pitch black even in full daylight. It's not a place for the claustrophobic. We were about 20 feet down a path between 2 stacks when 5 or 6 cans suddenly rained down from above. Only one made contact with Harrison, but it struck the back of his head. Except for a sharp grunt, he was silenced immediately. In all the panic of the morning, Harrison had forgotten his hard hat, and I never thought to question the manager about safety protocol. I rushed to his side. Blood was welling from a wound on his head, like a blooming red flower. I could hear more cans falling in the main walkways and in the narrow rows between other stacks, but I ignored them. My fingers instinctively went to his neck, searching for a pulse. After a few anxious seconds, I found it, faint but present. I grabbed Harrison's radio and called for help. Thankfully, emergency workers heard the cans falling and came to investigate. They helped carry Harrison out from between the pallets and into an ambulance waiting at the nearest exit. At the time, I felt nothing but pity and guilt for Harrison. Now I see that he was the lucky one. After taking a moment to collect myself, I decided to continue the inspection. Using Harrison's radio, I called Liam, the quality control manager, and asked him to help me. He responded that he was already in warehouse number 3. As I walked there, I noticed cans from various pallets scattered across the floor. This pattern of fallen cans continued all the way to warehouse number 3. I figured it must have been raccoons or maybe a few stray cats that had gotten in through the damaged section and were now climbing across the tops of the pallets. When I entered warehouse number 3, I immediately saw a large gathering of workers and volunteers standing near a collapsed row of pallets. Being in quality control, I couldn't help but wince. That was at least $30,000 worth of product ruined. As I approached, I noticed the workers muttering about something that clearly disturbed them. Liam turned away from the group, holding a gallon-sized can in his hands, and rushed toward me. "What's going on here?" I asked. "Have you heard about Harrison? Did you find something else?" Liam stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, and held up the gallon can. It was a standard container of beef stew. But as I took it from his hands, I saw 3 large puncture marks that had ripped through the metal on the other side. Claws. I looked back at the row of destroyed pallets. The can I held was probably the most intact of them all. Most looked like crumpled balls of tin foil, while others were torn open and completely emptied of their contents. "Jesus," I managed to stammer, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Whatever had opened these cans was huge and strong, very strong. I looked up at the tops of the surrounding pallet stacks, half hoping and half fearing what I might see. "Nothing." I sighed with momentary relief and asked Liam if he could escort me through warehouses 3 and 4. He agreed, clearly glad to get away from warehouse 3. Besides more knockdown cans and the destruction at the back of warehouse 5, there wasn't much else to see. If something was inside, it seemed to have primarily targeted the beef stew. Liam and I helped the rest of the workers sort through the mess and assess product losses, which took up the remainder of my shift. I went home last night exhausted and passed out on my couch almost immediately. I woke up at 4:37 this morning to the sound of my phone ringing. I let it ring since I still had a few more hours until work. Shortly after it stopped, I heard it vibrate again to signify that I had received a voicemail. Already awake, I decided to check it. I figured it was probably my mom having a nightmare about me. Instead, I had 3 missed calls and a voicemail from Dominic, a night shift quality control worker and friend from college. Given yesterday's events, I suspected something else had gone wrong. I couldn't make out much at first. It sounded like a typical pocket dial, but I could hear distant sounds, heavy breathing, hurried footsteps, the crash of cans hitting concrete, and then a bellowing roar. I've heard plenty of animals and weird noises before. Anyone who's heard a cougar scream knows they sound like a woman being murdered. But that roar, that was one of the most hellish sounds I've ever heard. I turned up the volume on my phone and held it close to my ear, waiting for another roar. There was silence for about 10 seconds, and then I heard a person quietly sobbing. "Please help. Oh God, please," the voice begged. This pleading continued for several seconds before another roar erupted, nearly bursting my eardrum and causing me to drop the phone. Then the voicemail ended. I checked the clock again, 4:44 in the morning. I didn't have to be at work for another 2 hours, but Dominic was obviously in serious trouble. I didn't stop to think. I just wanted to save my friend. Racing to the facility with my heart pounding in my ears, I had no idea what to expect. Flying into the closest parking space, I sprinted from my car and through the front offices. If I had taken my time, I would have noticed that less than half of the night shift's vehicles remained in the lot. All the rest had fled. When I entered the production area, I nearly fled myself. The power was completely out, except for the security lights. Those dim lights were enough to reveal the shimmer of red across the floor. Pools of blood slowly flowed into floor drains that were clogged with chunks of flesh, bone, and hair. I dropped to my knees and covered my mouth, trying not to scream, then vomited through my fingers. There was no escaping the smell. My body seemed frozen in place. Do I run? Do I scream? What do I do? My panic was broken by a series of gunshots from warehouse number 1, followed by screams that were abruptly cut short. I felt my bladder release slightly in fear. Guns don't stop this thing. What could? I heard the crash of cans as a pallet stack was knocked over. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted back to the storage room in the front offices. Once inside, I locked the doors and pulled out my phone. Dominic didn't answer. I can only assume that whatever was in the facility got him during the voicemail I'd listened to. Out of frustration and fear, I threw my phone against the wall and it shattered. A crazed sob escaped me. Why did I do that? Why didn't I run away? Am I going to die here? I broke down in tears. A few minutes passed, and then I heard the rumble of trucks outside the facility and saw lights flash through the lone window. Vehicles, people, help. I stood up and looked out the window. Instead of police or the emergency response vehicles from before, I saw military trucks. One of them was a large olive-green armored vehicle with a soldier standing in the turret. I assume it was his voice that came over their loudspeakers. Attention. This is a restricted area, now under military control. We are establishing a quarantine zone over this facility and the surrounding area. If there is anyone still inside, you will not be permitted to leave until we have completely confirmed the threat has been neutralized. He continued speaking, but I was too terrified to listen. I paced the room impatiently, feeling like a dead man walking. If what I had seen of the creature's strength was any indication, heavy artillery would probably be the only way to successfully remove this threat. I collapsed against the wall and buried my head in my hands. I remained in that position for a while, listening to the hustle and bustle of the military outside the building. I kept running through my options. Should I end it all? Should I risk trying to escape? Could I somehow lure the beast to the soldiers? It wasn't until I looked up and across the room that I got an idea worth considering. Directly across from me were the barrels of sanitizing chemicals I had labeled in detail yesterday morning. How did I not think of that right away? We have two types of industrial cleaner, amoclean and sani chloride. One of the biggest hazards of amoclean is that it's an oxidizing agent that can cause violent reactions with other chemicals. If amoclean is mixed with any chemicals containing chlorine, it reacts to release chlorine gas, deadly chlorine gas. Well, it just so happens that the main ingredient in sani chloride is chlorine. And I had about 10 50-gallon drums of each cleaner in the storage room. I grabbed a crowbar, a couple of air masks used when cleaning old machine parts, and rolled 3 drums of each onto a service cart. Taking a deep breath and trying to steady my trembling legs, I unlocked the door, pushed the cart out into the main hallway, and started toward the swing doors to production. Ramming through the doors, the drums almost spilled off the cart. But luckily, I maintained balance and continued to quickly push toward the quality control lab in the middle of production. I started to whistle and shout to attract the creature's attention, half expecting to be snatched up before I knew what was happening. There was no immediate response. I shouted louder and began banging the crowbar against one of the drums. Still nothing. The quality control lab is located in the center of the production area, with 2 steel doors leading in and no windows. I opened one of the doors, rolled the barrels off the cart and into the lab. The room was untouched. I tore my shirt off and stuffed it in the only floor drain. I put on 3 of the filter masks and pried off the top of 1 sani chloride barrel with the crowbar, allowing the chemicals to spill onto the floor. Where is it? Does it know I'm trying to trap it? With no time to waste on negative thoughts, I opened the other 2 barrels of sani chloride and added them to the pool of chemicals already a few inches deep. As I finished emptying the last drum, I heard a large crash and a subsequent growl from outside the door I hadn't entered through. It's here. I positioned the amoclean drums and began emptying them into the pool. I grabbed a few damaged cans from the countertop and opened the door. A humanoid creature was perched atop the production machinery, standing out in the dim glow of the security lights. It was a hideous thing, with long, sinewy arms and legs. Pale gray skin stretched too tight over bulging veins and rippling muscles. Its hands had more finger than palm, with black claws extending several inches from each digit. The claws were digging into something resting out of the light to its left. It lifted the object to its mouth, which looked like a shark's, rows of razor-sharp yellow teeth pushing out and over one another. The teeth sank into the object and tore away. Blood sprayed the air briefly as I made out the shape in its claws. A human leg. Nervously, I glanced up from the leg. Its eyes met mine. Adrenaline coursed through my body. I weakly tossed one of the damaged cans at it, dropped the others, and dashed back into the lab. I heard it behind me, moving as swiftly as a shadow. The chlorine gas fumes were already thick in the air, as the floor had turned into a toxic soup that spilled out into the production area. Behind me, the door didn't have a chance to close. The creature held it open and stared at me with black, empty eye sockets. My eyes burned from the fumes, and my nose was beginning to sting. I screamed with ferocity and kicked one of the empty drums at it with all the energy I had left. It leaped toward me with a matching shriek, caught the drum in midair, and then crashed into the chemical pool below. The far door slammed shut. I took my chance and quickly exited through the door at my back, slamming it closed. My only hope was that the steel doors would hold the creature. My eyes burned uncontrollably. I couldn't breathe properly through the multiple masks. I heard agonizing screams and yelps coming from behind the doors as my head began to spin. I did it. I killed it. Then everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was in the back of an ambulance. A military officer and what I assumed was a government scientist were quietly discussing something. They continued their hushed conversation for a few minutes until they realized I was awake. I was hooked up to oxygen and various monitoring equipment, but I managed to croak out a question. What was it? The scientist looked at me with curious eyes. We don't know for certain. We suspect it might be something that escaped from another location during the storm. But what we do know is that it had a particular taste for preserved meat. He paused. And that you managed to kill it. The look I gave him must have conveyed my disbelief, because the officer gave me a reassuring nod and said, "That's right. You stopped it. Now get some rest before they debrief you." I closed my eyes until we arrived at the hospital. When I woke in my bed, I searched through news channels for any report on the carnage, but there was nothing. I started to reflect on everything that had happened. Poor Harrison and Dominic. I wondered how many others had been killed. Then I remembered what the scientist had said in the ambulance. The creature had developed a craving for preserved meat. I bolted upright in my bed. If it was hungry for meat, why did it go for the beef stew cans first? The nurse who was checking my vitals gave me a strange look. "What are you talking about?" Before I could answer, my phone rang. They'd given me a replacement. It was Liam. "You need to come back," he said, his voice trembling. "They found something in warehouse 4. "What?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "Eggs," he whispered. "Dozens of them. And they're hatching." I can't sleep, and I thought sharing the day's events might help make sense of it all. I'm hoping someone here will believe me, or at least understand what happened today. I babysit for a living in Newport, Rhode Island. It's not the most glamorous work, but once you're over 21 and have built up solid references, it becomes a reliable source of income. Many families in this historic coastal town especially the wealthy summer residents, are willing to pay well for a trusted sitter. It's kept me afloat while I finish my marine biology degree at the university. Of course, sometimes work dries up. This past winter was particularly tough as one of my regular families relocated to Boston, leaving me scrambling through my savings and asking friends for leads until spring break when families start visiting their summer homes again. Last week, I was doing a quick fill-in job for a child I occasionally watch when I got an email alert that a family in one of the historic mansions overlooking the Atlantic needed someone to watch their daughter for 2 weeks. I sensed our situations could solve each other, so I quickly sent my contact information and arranged to call the mother after finishing my current job. We connected immediately, and I arrived at their breathtaking oceanfront property early the next morning to meet my new temporary charge. She was a bright, happy little girl named Maddie. No signs of adjustment issues or social awkwardness. She seemed perfectly at ease in the massive historic mansion that her parents had rented for the season. Maddie was very much the kind of 7-year-old who loves wearing multiple bracelets at once and insists on tutus over her leggings. Since most of my experience had been with rowdy boys, it was refreshing to do activities like painting nails and creating elaborate sandcastles with seashell decorations. While we were walking along the private beach below the mansion, I heard Maddie talking to herself. I asked if she was playing pretend, and she said she was talking to her friend. She pronounced the friend's name as Marina, and I didn't think much of it. Imaginary friends are completely normal for children, and Maddie even reassured me that she and Marina were just playing tag along the shoreline. Over the next few hours, she mentioned that Marina was a little girl about 9 years old, 2 years older than Maddie herself, and that she liked to swim. It was cute, and I wasn't going to discourage harmless, imaginative play. I'd had imaginary friends of my own as a child. Later that day, I mentioned that I collected vintage ocean-themed jewelry, and Maddie asked if I could bring some pieces over to show her. After getting reassurance from her mother that she'd be gentle with them, I said I would, and I showed up the next day with a small velvet pouch containing my collection. Maddie was particularly fascinated by an antique silver locket with a detailed mermaid engraving and blue enamel work. I made a mental note to find something similar, but less valuable for Maddie before my time with her ended. While we were examining the jewelry in the sunroom overlooking the ocean, I heard a strange sound coming from the direction of Maddie's bedroom, a sort of rhythmic splashing, like water being disturbed. This being a coastal mansion, the sound of water wasn't unusual, but this seemed to be coming from inside the house. I casually mentioned that we should check if someone had left a faucet running. "Oh," said Maddie, "that's not a faucet. That's Marina." I frowned slightly. "I thought you said Marina was a little girl." "Well, she doesn't look like one anymore," Maddie replied matter-of-factly. I was sufficiently unnerved by this that I suggested we go somewhere else that day, perhaps the Maritime Museum downtown. We ended up at the Newport Historical Society Museum, where they had a special exhibit on maritime disasters along the Rhode Island coast. Maddie asked if we could see the shipwreck section because Marina wants to show me something, and I agreed, figuring she was just incorporating the museum visit into her imaginary play. Maddie started running through the exhibit halls, and I followed her until she stopped excitedly in front of a glass case and pointed. The display contained artifacts recovered from the wreck of the passenger ship Atlantic Star, which had sunk off the Newport coast in 1892. Among the items was a child's silver locket, remarkably similar to the one in my collection, but badly corroded from its time underwater. The placard stated that the locket had belonged to 9-year-old Marina Sullivan, one of the youngest victims of the disaster. That was unsettling, but I didn't judge. I had macabre interests at Maddie's age too. My fascination with marine biology had actually started with an obsession with the Titanic disaster when I was 8. As for the name coincidence, Marina is a natural name choice for an imaginary friend when you live by the ocean. The chittering sound was probably just pipes in the old house, and Maddie had incorporated that into her game. That evening, I mentioned what had happened to Maddie's mother. The color drained from her face. She showed you Marina's locket. You saw it? Yes, I replied, confused by her reaction. Why? I thought it was cute. She has a thing for history. It's educational. Maddie's mother pulled me into the kitchen, while Maddie played with her toys in the living room and lowered her voice. She explained that their family had only rented this mansion 2 weeks ago, arriving 3 days before I started. On their first night, Maddie woke them up, saying she needed to go down to the beach because Marina wants to show me something. Marina made her first appearance before they'd ever visited any museums or learned anything about Newport's history. In fact, it was Maddie who insisted they visit the Historical Society Museum because Marina lived a long time ago and wants to show me her things. When Maddie's mother brought her there, Maddie had run straight to the shipwreck exhibit, stopped at the Atlantic Star display, and excitedly told her mother, "There's Marina's locket." I didn't know how to respond and suddenly felt very uncomfortable. I changed the subject to Maddie's fondness for my jewelry collection, and we agreed I'd try to find her a child-friendly locket of her own. Marina never showed any signs of malevolence toward Maddie, though I still couldn't shake the memory of that splashing sound from the bedroom. It was only a few days before the end of my time with them that I remembered reading about a popular Victorian-era belief that the spirits of those lost at sea sometimes returned as rhythmic sounds of water, forever trying to reach shore. The last day with the family was bittersweet. As a parting gift, I gave Maddie a small silver-plated locket with a mermaid design I'd found at an antique shop downtown. It wasn't valuable, but she was thrilled with it. Before I left, she whispered something that made my skin prickle with goosebumps. Marina says thank you for finding her locket's sister. She says now she can stop looking. That night, a violent storm hit Newport. The next morning, news reports stated that several artifacts had been washed up on beaches across the area, items that had supposedly been lost in shipwrecks over a century ago. Among them, found on the private beach below Maddie's rental home, was a child's badly corroded silver shoe buckle inscribed with the initials MS. I received a text from Maddie's mother yesterday. They've decided to cut their vacation short and return to Connecticut. The message included a photo of Maddie standing on the beach, wearing both lockets, mine and the one from the museum gift shop, and holding what appeared to be the silver shoe buckle. She was smiling broadly, her wet hair plastered to her face as if she'd been swimming. Behind her, captured only as a blur at the edge of the frame, was what looked like another young girl, also dripping wet, with long dark hair obscuring her face. When I called to ask about the other child in the photo, Maddie's mother sounded confused. What other child? Maddie was alone on the beach. I took that picture myself. I zoomed in on the image later and noticed something I had missed. The blurred figure wasn't standing on the sand. The lower half of her body appeared to be submerged in what looked like a small pool of seawater, despite being several feet away from the shoreline. I don't babysit at oceanfront properties anymore. And when I walk along Newport's beaches for my marine biology field studies, I keep well away from the water's edge, especially at sunset when the tide begins to turn. Sometimes, just as the sun touches the horizon, I swear I can hear the faint sound of a child's laughter mingling with the rhythm of the waves. I never thought I would regret it. It was stupid, really. I was standing in line to buy a lunch ticket in the cafeteria at Lincoln Middle School. My friend Zach comes over and says in a Darth Vader voice, "I will trade you a lunch ticket for your immortal soul." I told him to shut up, so he said it again, this time emphasizing immortal soul to make it sound scarier. "Seriously, your immortal soul, and you don't have to wait in this line," he insisted. "Fine," I said, grabbed the ticket out of his hand, and walked over to the lunch counter. He followed me. "Hey, I have another one. Do you think Madison might give me her immortal soul?" I didn't think she would. Madison would just wrinkle her nose and ignore him. "No, try Jessica. I bet you could at least get her to kiss you for it if you're lucky." I watched him head over to Jessica, and after she shyly kissed his cheek, she followed him to the lunch counter, ticket in hand. Behind his back, he gave me a thumbs up. Zach moved to California not long after that, and who really keeps track of middle school friends? No one. I grew up, got married, had a daughter, and never thought about trading my immortal soul again. Then one rainy night, I was driving my family on Interstate 95 and dozed off for just a second. In that brief moment, we ran into slowed traffic, and I was behind a semi-truck. The last thing I remember is my wife screaming my name. I swerved, but not soon enough. My car hit the back of the truck on the passenger side. My wife and my daughter, who was sitting behind my wife on the passenger side, were killed instantly. The next thing I remember is lying on the wet asphalt with paramedics around me, trying to revive me. It was cold. I was thirsty, and the emergency lights hurt my eyes. I remember someone putting an oxygen mask over my face, and everything went dark as I lost consciousness. Then I remember waking up in a strange place. I wasn't in a hospital, but I was drifting in and out of awareness. The memories from this period are fragmentary, almost like an old silent film, but less coherent. Every so often, someone would stand over me, but they were a blur, flickering in and out of my perception. As I recovered and became more stable, no one came at all. I don't know how long it was from my arrival to when my eyes were finally able to focus, but the first thing I was truly conscious of was the sound of running water and the metallic clinking of what I would soon realize were surgical instruments being cleaned and sterilized. "Things are going well, Nathan," said a calm voice I didn't recognize. "I'm sorry about your wife and daughter." There was nothing I could do for them. They were dead for too long before they were brought to me. He walked over, and because it was difficult to hold my head up, the first thing I remember about him was his hands. It was the only detail I could see clearly. He was drying them on a white disposable towel. They were large with flat fingers, and coarse dark hair covered the back of them and his forearms thickly. But you were different. After all, you sold me your soul. I like to think that perhaps because of that day, my will for you to live overrode your desire to die with your family. Zach, I heard him chuckle softly and felt that he was pleased. You're fortunate to have befriended such a brilliant surgeon so early in life. It was comforting to have him there. And while he would leave during the day, at night he would come back, look after me, and keep me company. It turns out I was in his basement, which he had roughly modified for my care. He brought down his favorite armchair and a television. And in the evenings, we would watch shows or he would read to me from his armchair as I recovered and slowly grew stronger. One night while he was reading, he stopped rather abruptly and became thoughtful. Instead of asking what he was thinking about, which was my first instinct, I asked how he had known about my accident, how long he had been back in the area, and why he hadn't contacted me sooner. He seemed very pleased with my questions. I actually have a confession to make, Nathan, he told me. Ever since that day back in the 7th grade when you sold your soul, I felt responsible for you. You and Jessica both. I followed your lives loosely. I felt tied to you, but you never contacted me. He sighed. I never had time for social calls. I've always had bigger plans. And then he read until I fell asleep. A few nights later, I was well enough to sit up. He asked if I'd like some coffee. Sitting up and drinking coffee sounded like a miracle to me. When I asked for a cappuccino, he smiled, prepared the drink with his expensive machine, handed it to me, and sat in his chair. How long has cappuccino been your favorite? He asked. I thought about it, then frowned. Actually, I've never really liked coffee before, I admitted. So since now, we both found that funny and laughed, the first time I'd laughed in weeks. Cappuccino has been my favorite since my 2nd year of medical school, he said. He was silent for a minute, and I knew he was thinking about wording whatever he was going to say next very carefully. But I was getting sleepy. The coffee was having the opposite effect than expected. I could see why Zach enjoyed it though. Nathan, he said, I save lives every day. I save good people, people like you. If I could have, I would have saved your wife and daughter if it would have been in my power. Despair, pain, and guilt flooded over me. I'd been so content with Zach that I hadn't thought about them in weeks. But I was getting sleepier too. Nathan, you do understand I could have saved them if I had been more powerful, don't you? I nodded weakly. Nathan, he said, those many years ago I asked you for something. But since you didn't really believe I wanted it, I didn't get what I needed, not completely. I'm going to ask you for it again. I'm sure I don't need to explain our connection now that my thoughts are your thoughts, my tastes are your tastes, and my will can be imposed on you. Now that you really see what I can do, now that you know how important I can be to people, can you deny me the power to save more lives? To use a greater force to impose my will? To do great things? I was so sleepy. My eyelids were growing heavy. Nathan, I can still save you. Will you help me do great things? Can I have your soul?" The room was growing dark, and my eyelids were closing as I consented. Since then, I've helped him do the same thing to Jessica and countless others. Every time I watch the process, then the ritual, I see less and less resistance as he grows stronger. Everything he does is remarkable. He's a brilliant man, but not everything he does is good. Some people die. My only comfort is that someday he will die, and someone will collect his soul. But that thought grows weaker with every addition he makes to his collection. Last week, I saw him reading an ancient book late at night. I wasn't supposed to see it, but as I brought him his nightly cappuccino, I glimpsed a page with intricate diagrams of human bodies, with what looked like energy patterns flowing between them. The title at the top of the page read Soul Transference, Achieving Immortality Through Essence Migration. I realized then what he's planning. He's not collecting souls for power alone. He's creating vessels. And I fear that when the time comes, those of us who gave our souls willingly will be the first to receive something else in return. The worst part, sometimes I catch myself hoping I'll be chosen first, because despite everything, I still admire him. And that terrifies me more than anything else. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.